You are sitting in the small office attached to the glass furnace on the island of Murano, and it is the autumn of the year 1576. The room is not large and it is not small. It is just wide enough for a desk and a stool and a set of shelves built into the plaster wall. The floor beneath your feet is made of wide planks of larch wood that have been worn smooth over many years by the passage of boots and the scrape of stool legs. They are a pale greyish-brown in the morning light that comes through the single window set high in the wall to your left. The window itself is made of small, round panes of glass set into a lead frame, and some of those panes have a slight greenish tint, while others are more clear, and the effect of looking through them is like looking through the surface of the lagoon when a breeze disturbs it. Outside that window is the lagoon of Venice, and the water is a flat grey colour under the overcast sky of early morning. There is no sun visible yet, and the light seems to come from everywhere at once without a source. The water stretches away from the island toward the faint outline of the main city in the distance, and at this hour the shape of Venice is little more than a smudge of darker grey against the grey of the sky, with a few bell towers rising like thin strokes of charcoal. The only sounds that reach you in this small room are two distinct and constant noises. The first is the muffled deep roar of the main furnace that sits on the other side of the thick brick wall behind your back. It is a sound that has been present on this island for as long as anyone can remember, and it never truly stops. It only changes slightly in pitch depending on the stage of the work and the force of the bellows. The second sound is the water of the canal lapping against the stone steps just outside the door that leads to the narrow fondamenta. The tide is coming in now, and with each small wave there is a soft shushing sound as the water rises and then retreats across the algae-covered stone. These two sounds together form a kind of constant low hum that fills the space and makes the silence inside the office seem deeper than it really is. On the desk in front of you is the ledger book. It is the primary object of your attention and the reason you have come into this room before the rest of the furnace workers have fully begun their day. The ledger is a large volume bound in dark brown leather that has been rubbed smooth at the corners from years of handling. The leather has a particular smell that is a combination of old paper and the faint tang of the iron gall ink that has been used on its pages for nearly 2 decades. The spine is cracked in 3 places, but the binding still holds firm and the pages do not come loose when the book is opened. The cover itself is unadorned except for a small blind stamped emblem in the center that shows a simple lion of St. Mark, and this mark is so worn now that you can only make it out by tilting the book to catch the light at the right angle. You reach forward and place both hands on the cover of the ledger, and you feel the slight roughness of the leather against the pads of your fingers. The weight of the book is considerable, and when you open it, the spine makes a soft creaking sound like the timbers of a boat settling at anchor. You turn the heavy pages one by one, and they make a dry whispering sound as they move past each other. The pages themselves are made of thick cotton paper that has yellowed only slightly at the edges, and each one is ruled with faint red lines that divide the page into columns. The columns have headings written in a neat, careful hand that was not your own, but belonged to your husband who is no longer here. The ink he used for those headings has faded to a rusty brown color, but the words are still perfectly legible, and they read from left to right: data for the date, descrizione for the description, entrata for the incoming sums, and usita for the outgoing payments. You are Signora Foscari, and you have been the keeper of these accounts since the spring, when the fever took your husband away in the space of 3 days. You did not expect to be sitting in this chair, and you did not expect to be the one who trimmed the quill and opened this book each morning, but here you are, and the book must be kept. The glass must be made, and the workers must be paid, and the agents from the German trading house will arrive next month, expecting to see a neat and balanced set of books. And so you sit on the wooden stool, with the wool shawl wrapped around your shoulders, and you look down at the open page, which is blank, except for the red lines and the faint impression of the page that was written on yesterday and which now lies on the left side of the open book. The first thing you do is reach for the quill that rests in a small clay pot filled with fine sand. The quill is a wing feather from a goose, and it is a dull, greyish-white color with a slight curve to the shaft. You pick it up and hold it between your thumb and forefinger, and you examine the nib which you trimmed yourself the previous evening with a small sharp knife. The cut is clean, and the slit in the center of the nib is just wide enough to hold the ink without dripping. You set the quill down again on the desk next to the inkwell, and you reach for the inkwell itself. The inkwell is made of a heavy, dark green glass that was blown in this very furnace many years ago, and it has a wide, stable base and a narrow neck that keeps the ink from evaporating too quickly. You remove the small cork stopper, and the smell of the ink rises up toward you, a sharp, metallic scent of oak galls and iron sulfate, mixed with the sweeter smell of gum arabic that helps the ink flow smoothly from the nib. You pour a small amount of ink into a shallow dish that sits beside the inkwell, because dipping the quill directly into the main well would introduce dust and fibers from the paper into the supply, and over time this would thicken the ink and make it unusable. You watch the black liquid spread across the bottom of the dish, and it reflects the faint light from the window in a way that makes it look like a tiny pool of dark water on a stone path. You dip the nib into the dish, and you tap it gently against the rim to remove the excess, and then you hold the quill poised above the first line of the ledger page. The first entry you must make concerns the shipment of soda ash that arrived 2 days ago from the Levant. The soda ash is an essential ingredient in the making of Venetian glass because it lowers the melting temperature of the silica sand and allows the glass to become clear and bright. Without it, the glass would be cloudy and full of small bubbles, and the mirrors and goblets that make this island famous would be worth very little. The ash comes from the burning of certain coastal plants that grow in the marshes of Syria and Egypt, and it is shipped in heavy canvas sacks that are sewn shut with coarse twine. You remember watching the barge come to the loading steps and the men carrying the sacks up to the storage shed one by one while you stood at the doorway and counted each sack as it passed. There were 14 sacks in total, and each one weighed approximately 120 Venetian pounds. The cost recorded on the manifest that the ship's clerk handed to you was 47 ducats and 16 soldi. You write the date first. It is the 15th day of October in the year 1576, and you write this as 15 Ottobre 1576 in a clear, upright hand. The ink flows smoothly from the nib and leaves a wet, shining line on the paper that will dry to a matte black in a few minutes. Below the date in the description column you write Cenere di soda de Levante quattro di Sigi, sacchi, which means soda ash from the Levant, 14 sacks. Then in the outgoing column you write the amount, D47s, 16. The letters D and S stand for ducati and soldi, and you make them carefully so that there can be no confusion when the German merchants review the books. You pause for a moment and look at what you have written, and then you lift the quill and wait for the ink to dry. While the ink dries, you look out of the small window again, and you see that a single fishing boat is moving slowly across the lagoon. The boat is a flat-bottomed sandalo with a single man standing at the stern, and he is pushing a long oar through the water with a slow, steady rhythm that does not seem to hurry. The boat moves from left to right across the frame of the window, and then it is gone, and the water is empty again. A few gulls are standing on the wooden posts that mark the channel, and they do not move or call out. They simply stand there with their heads tucked slightly into their bodies against the chill of the morning air. The ink on the page is dry now, and you turn your attention to the next entry, which concerns the river pebbles from the Ticino River. These pebbles are small, smooth stones that are almost pure white in color, and they are crushed into a fine powder and added to the glass mixture to provide the silica that forms the body of the glass. The pebbles come from a specific stretch of the river near the town of Pavia, where the current has tumbled them for centuries and worn away all their sharp edges. They arrive on the island in large wooden barrels that are marked with the stamp of the quarry agent. You have 3 barrels remaining from the last shipment, and today you must record the cost of those barrels even though they were delivered last month, because the bill from the quarry has only just arrived with the courier who came across the water from Mestre yesterday afternoon. You dip the quill again, and you write the description, Caiatoli di Ticino per silice 3 barili, which means Ticino pebbles for silicia 3 barrels. The cost is smaller than the soda ash, and you enter the figure of D812 in the outgoing column. The numbers are written in a firm hand, and you notice that the second digit of the 8 has a slight curve that makes it look almost like a small figure sleeping on its side. You set the quill down, and you rest your hands flat on the desk on either side of the open book, and you feel the cool, smooth surface of the wood beneath your palms. The desk is made of walnut, and it has a dark, rich color that has been polished over the years by the movement of sleeves and hands and the occasional drop of oil from a lamp. There is a small knot in the wood just to the right of the ledger, and you can feel its slight roughness through the thin wool of your sleeve. The sound of the furnace changes slightly, and you recognize the moment when the master glassmaker has opened the small door of the glory hole to gather a bit of molten glass onto the end of his blowpipe. The roar becomes higher and sharper for a few seconds, and then it settles back into its usual deep hum. The master's name is Lorenzo, and he was your husband's apprentice for 12 years before he became a master himself. He is a quiet man with large hands and a face that has been reddened permanently by the heat of the fire. He does not speak to you often because there is no need for many words between the person who keeps the books and the person who makes the glass. Each morning he comes to the office door and he knocks once, and you tell him the schedule for the day based on the orders you have received, and then he nods and goes back to the furnace room. You turn the page of the ledger and you look at the previous entries that were written by your husband in his own hand. His writing was smaller than yours and more cramped, with letters that leaned slightly to the right as if they were all hurrying toward the edge of the page. You can see where he made a small correction to a number in the month of June where he had written a 6 that looked too much like a 5, and he had carefully crossed it out and written the correct figure beside it. The crossed out number is still visible beneath the single line of ink, and you can see the exact shape of the mistake he made on a Tuesday morning, not long before he became ill. You look at this for a long moment, and then you turn the page back to the current day where your own writing sits fresh and black on the pale paper. There is another sound now beyond the walls of the office, and it is the sound of a wooden shutter being opened somewhere further down the fondamenta. You can hear the creak of the iron hinges and the soft thud of the shutter being pushed back against the brick wall. This sound is followed by the faint voice of a woman calling to someone inside her house. And though you cannot make out the words, you recognize the tone as the ordinary morning greeting of one person to another. The voice fades and the sound of the water returns to fill the space it left behind. You reach into the pocket of your wool gown and you take out a small folded piece of paper that you placed there last evening. The paper contains a list of the items that must be ordered before the end of the month, and you unfold it carefully on the desk next to the ledger. The list is written in your own hand, and the items are arranged in no particular order because you wrote them down as they occurred to you while you were sitting by the small fire in your room. The list includes the following: more fire clay for the crucibles, because 2 of the current ones have developed small cracks near the rim. A new iron rod for the pontello, because the old one has become thin and bent from years of use. A replacement leather belt for the bellows mechanism, and a small quantity of manganese from the apothecary in Venice to be used for removing the greenish tint from the clearest glass. You will not attend to these items today, because today is for the ledger and for the quiet accounting of what has already been spent and what has already arrived. You fold the list again and you put it back into your pocket, and you feel the weight of the heavy iron key that also rests in that pocket and which opens the door to the storeroom where the finished glass is kept under lock. The key is cold against your fingers, even through the fabric of the pocket. You look at the ledger once more, and you see that the page is nearly full. There is space for only 3 more entries, and then you will have to turn to a fresh page and begin the process of ruling the columns again. You decide to save that task for tomorrow because the light is still good, and the morning is still quiet, and there is no reason to rush anything at all. You take a small piece of blotting paper from a stack that sits at the corner of the desk, and you press it gently over the wet ink of the 2 entries you have made. The blotting paper absorbs the excess ink, and when you lift it away, the writing beneath is crisp and dry and will not smudge if you close the book. You close the ledger slowly, and you hear the soft, heavy sound of the cover settling against the pages. You place both hands on the cover again, and you feel the warmth that has transferred from your palms into the leather over the course of the past hour. The book sits solid and heavy on the desk, and it contains the entire history of this furnace for the past several years in columns of neat, faded numbers. Tomorrow you will open it again, and you will write the cost of the manganese and the fire clay and the iron rod and the leather belt. But for now, the book is closed, and the quill is resting in its pot of sand, and the ink in the shallow dish is beginning to form a thin skin on its surface as it dries in the cool air of the morning. You sit for a moment longer, and you listen to the sound of the furnace, which continues without pause, and to the sound of the water, which also continues without pause. The 2 sounds are so constant that they have become a single sound in your mind, and you can no longer separate one from the other. The light from the window has shifted slightly, and now it falls across the corner of the desk and illuminates a small area of the wood where the grain is particularly fine and tight. You watch the light and you wait, and you do nothing else because there is nothing else that needs to be done at this exact moment. The morning moves forward, and the lagoon remains grey, and the glass continues to melt in the crucibles behind the brick wall, and you are simply there in the small office with the closed book and the still air and the quiet weight of the wool shawl around your shoulders. You have moved from the ledger that tracks the chemical ingredients to a second book that sits on a lower shelf of the desk. This second book is smaller than the first, and its cover is made of a rougher leather that has never been polished or treated with oil. The color is a dull brown with patches of darker staining where water, or perhaps a splash of wine, touched the surface years ago. The spine of this book is intact, and the pages inside are made of a cheaper paper that has small flecks of wood pulp visible in its surface. This is the fuel ledger, and it is where every piece of wood that arrives on the island for this furnace is recorded by weight and by type and by the name of the supplier. You lift the book from the shelf and you place it on the desk next to the main ledger, which remains closed for now. The fuel ledger is lighter in your hands, and when you open it the pages make a crisper sound because the paper is thinner and more brittle. The columns in this book are ruled in the same red ink, but the headings are written in a hand that is neither yours nor your husband's. This book was started by your husband's father many years ago, and the first few pages are filled with entries that date back to a time before you were born. The ink on those earliest pages has faded to a pale brown that is almost the color of weak tea, and the letters are formed in an older style, with more flourishes and loops. Today you are concerned with the current month and the current supply of wood. The furnace consumes wood at a steady rate that varies only slightly, depending on the type of glass being made and the number of hours the fires are kept at full heat. You know from experience that the main melting fire requires approximately 300 pounds of dense beechwood each full working day, and that the annealing lure, which runs at a lower temperature, consumes about half that amount in lighter alder wood. These two types of wood are not interchangeable because the beech burns with a hotter and longer flame, while the alder burns more quickly and produces a gentler heat that is ideal for the long tunnel where the finished glass cools over many hours. You turn the pages of the fuel ledger until you reach the current month, and you run your finger down the column that lists the deliveries received. The last entry was made 6 days ago, and it records the arrival of a barge carrying beechwood from the mainland. The amount listed is 2,000 Venetian pounds, and the supplier is noted as the Bertelli family, who manage a small forest holding near the town of Treviso. You have dealt with the Bertelli family for many years, and you know that their wood is consistently dry and well seasoned and free of the rot that sometimes affects timber that has been floated down the rivers for too long. Today you must check the actual stock that remains in the woodshed, because there is a difference between the number written in the book and the number that sits stacked against the wall. The book says there should be approximately 800 pounds of beechwood remaining, but you have a sense that this figure may be slightly high. The master Lorenzo mentioned yesterday that the fire seemed to burn through the wood faster than usual during the making of a large batch of window glass, and this kind of observation is worth checking. You close the fuel ledger and you stand up from the stool, and you feel the slight stiffness in your back from sitting in one position for so long. The office has a second door that opens directly onto the side yard of the furnace compound. This door is made of thick planks with iron straps, and it swings outward on heavy hinges that protest with a low groan when you push against it. You step outside and the air is immediately different from the air inside the office. It is cooler, and it carries the smell of the lagoon, which is a mixture of salt and the faint organic scent of the mud flats that are exposed at low tide. There's also the smell of wood smoke, which hangs over the entire island like a thin blanket and never truly dissipates even when the wind blows from the sea. The woodshed is a simple structure with a roof made of terracotta tiles and 3 walls of brick. The fourth side is open to the yard to allow the barge workers to unload the wood directly into the storage area without having to navigate a narrow doorway. The roof overhangs the open side by several feet to keep the rain from soaking the stacked wood. You walk across the yard and the ground beneath your feet is packed earth, mixed with crushed brick and small fragments of broken glass that glitter dully in the grey light. These fragments are everywhere on Murano, and they have been trodden into the soil for centuries so that the very ground of the island sparkles faintly when the sun is low. You reach the woodshed and you stop at the edge of the stack of beechwood. The logs are cut to a uniform length of about 3 feet, and they are split into quarters and stacked in neat rows that alternate direction with each layer to allow air to circulate. The stack rises to just above the height of your shoulder, and it extends back into the shadow of the shed where the light does not reach. The wood is a pale silvery grey on the outside, where the bark has been removed, and the ends of each log show the tight rings of the beech tree, which are closer together than the rings of faster growing trees. You reach out and touch the end of one log, and you feel the slight roughness of the cut surface and the cool, dry texture of wood that has been seasoning for at least a year. Counting the logs is a slow and methodical process that requires patience and attention. You do not count each individual piece because that would take until the afternoon. Instead, you count the number of logs in one row, and you multiply that number by the number of rows, and then you subtract the visible gaps where a log has been removed for the fire. You move along the face of the stack, and you count silently to yourself, and your lips do not move, but the numbers form in your mind one after another. There are 22 logs in the first row you examine, and there are 14 rows visible from this side. The total for this section is 308 logs. Each log weighs approximately 6 pounds on average, and so this section contains roughly 1,848 pounds of wood. You move to the next section of the stack, which is made of the alder wood used for the annealing layer. The alder logs are smaller in diameter, and they are cut to a shorter length because they do not need to burn as long. The bark is still attached to many of these logs, and it is a dark greyish-brown color, with small patches of pale green lichen growing on the north-facing sides. The alder stack is lower than the beech stack, and it extends further back into the shed because the alder is used more slowly. You count the rows and the logs in each row, and you arrive at a figure of approximately 500 pounds remaining. You take a small piece of charcoal from a pocket sewn into the lining of your gown, and you make a few marks on a scrap of paper that you brought with you from the office. The marks are simple tallies that you will transfer to the fuel ledger when you return indoors. The actual amount of beechwood is slightly less than the book suggested, and you make a note to adjust the entry when you next sit at the desk. The difference is not large, and it does not indicate any theft or carelessness. It simply means that the furnace ran a little hotter during the window glass production and consumed more fuel than the standard calculation would predict. This is the kind of small discrepancy that occurs in any furnace, and the only proper response is to note it down and move forward. While you stand at the edge of the woodshed, you hear the sound of a boat approaching the loading steps that are located at the end of the fondamenta just beyond the furnace wall. The sound is the rhythmic splash of a single oar and the occasional bump of the hull against the stone as the current pushes the boat sideways. You walk to the corner of the shed, and you look toward the canal, and you see a flat-bottomed barge coming slowly toward the steps. The barge is piled high with more beechwood, and the wood is covered with a coarse canvas cloth that has been tied down with ropes. A single man stands at the stern, and he is using a long oar to guide the heavily laden boat toward the mooring ring set into the stone wall. This is the regular delivery from the Bertelli family, and you had expected it to arrive yesterday, but the wind on the lagoon was unfavorable, and many of the barges stayed in port rather than risk crossing the open water with heavy loads. You walk toward the loading steps, and you stop at a distance of about 10 feet from the water's edge. The man on the barge sees you, and he raises one hand in a brief greeting, but he does not speak. He's wearing a simple tunic of undyed wool, and a cap pulled low over his forehead, and his face is weathered by years of sun and wind on the water. The reason he does not come closer, and the reason you do not approach the edge of the steps, is the plague that is moving through the main city of Venice. The health authorities have issued orders that all persons traveling from the city to the outer islands must maintain a distance of at least 8 feet when conducting business. No one is certain if this distance is sufficient to prevent the spread of the sickness, but everyone observes it because the alternative is to risk the closure of the entire furnace and the loss of the livelihood of every family on the island. And so the barge pilot stays in his boat, and you stay on the stones of the fondamenta, and you conduct your business across the water and the air between you. The pilot cups his hands around his mouth, and he calls out across the distance. The delivery is for 500 pounds of beechwood from the Bertelli holding, he says, and the price is the same as last month, which is 12 soldi per £100. His voice carries clearly across the water, but it is flattened by the distance and the moisture in the air, so that it sounds like a voice coming from very far away, even though he is only 20 feet from where you stand. You nod to show that you have heard, and you make a mark on your paper scrap to record the amount. You call back to him that the wood can be stacked at the far end of the shed, where there is space, and that the payment will be made in the usual manner through the agent in Venice at the end of the month. The pilot nods, and he begins to untie the ropes that hold the canvas cover in place. You do not stay to watch the unloading, because there is no need. The pilot and his helper, who has just appeared from beneath the canvas cover, will stack the wood themselves, and they know where it goes and how it should be arranged. You turn away from the canal, and you walk back across the yard toward the office door. The sound of the wood being unloaded follows you, the thump of each log landing on the stone, the grunt of the men as they lift the heavier pieces, and the occasional splash when a piece of bark falls into the water and floats away on the current. Back inside the office, you sit down again on the stool, and you open the fuel ledger to the current page. You take up the quill, and you dip it into the ink dish, and you write the date and the description of the new delivery. Fagio de Bertoli 1500 Libre you write in the incoming column. The beechwood from Bertelli £1,500. Then you write the cost which you will pay later, D1s 16 for the total amount. The ink dries quickly on this thinner paper, and you do not need to use the blotting sheet. After the wood entry is complete, you turn your attention to the matter of the clay that is used to make the crucibles in which the glass melts. The crucibles are large bowl-shaped containers made of a special fire clay that can withstand the intense heat of the furnace without cracking or melting. Each crucible lasts for approximately 3 to 4 months of continuous use before it must be replaced, because the constant expansion and contraction of the heating and cooling eventually creates small cracks that widen over time. You have 2 crucibles currently in use in the main furnace and a third that sits in reserve in the corner of the furnace room. The reserve crucible was made 6 months ago, and it has developed a small crack near the rim that makes it unsuitable for holding the full weight of molten glass. You open a third book that is even smaller than the fuel ledger, and which is dedicated solely to the inventory of crucibles and the clay used to make them. This book is bound in simple cardboard covered with a piece of scrap leather, and it contains only a few dozen pages. The clay comes from a specific pit near the town of Vicenza, where the earth has a particular composition that includes a high proportion of alumina and very little iron. The clay is dug from the pit, and then it is washed and strained to remove any small stones or organic matter, and then it is formed into large blocks that are wrapped in damp cloth and shipped to Murano by barge. The price of this clay has risen slightly in the past month, and you have noted this in the margin of the crucible ledger. The reason for the increase is simple, and it is connected to the same sickness that keeps the barge pilot standing at a distance on the water. Fewer men are working in the clay pits, and fewer barges are making the journey from Vicenza to the lagoon. The supply is smaller, and so the price rises to match the scarcity. You recall the new price, which is now 14 soldi per block, rather than the 12 soldi it cost in the spring. You write the figure carefully, and you note the date of the change, so that when the German merchants review the books, they will see that the increase was justified by the circumstances of the wider world. The light through the small window has changed again, and it is now a paler grey that suggests the morning is advancing toward midday. You can hear the sounds of the furnace workers moving about in the main room, and the occasional sharp ring of iron tools being set down on the stone floor. The master Lorenzo will be preparing the next gather of glass, and soon the bellows will be worked with more vigor to raise the temperature for the afternoon's production. You close the crucible ledger and you place it back on the shelf next to the fuel ledger. The main ledger remains on the desk, and you look at its closed cover, and you think about the entries you will make tomorrow, but you do not open it now. You sit for a while and you listen to the sounds of the furnace and the canal and the distant unloading of wood. The shawl around your shoulders has slipped slightly, and you pull it back into place, and you feel the weight of the wool settling against your collarbone. The morning has been productive in a quiet way, and the numbers in the books now match the reality of the woodshed and the clay supply. There is a satisfaction in this matching of figures to objects, but it is a very small and muted satisfaction that does not disrupt the calm of the day. You rest your hands on the desk and you wait for nothing in particular, while the furnace hums on and the water laps at the stones and the autumn morning continues its slow passage toward the afternoon. The office door closes behind you with a soft click of the iron latch falling into its catch. You are standing now on the narrow fondamenta that runs along the side of the furnace building, and you are facing the canal called the Rio dei Vitri, which is the main waterway of this part of the island. The fondamenta is a paved walkway made of large flat stones that have been set into the ground so long ago that their edges are now rounded and uneven. Some of the stones are a pale grey colour with small flecks of white that catch the light, and others are a warmer reddish brown that comes from the clay that was mixed into the mortar when they were first laid. Between the stones there are gaps where the mortar has crumbled away over the years, and in these gaps small plants have taken root. A type of grass that stays low to the ground, and a creeping plant with tiny round leaves that are the colour of jade. You turn to your left and you begin to walk along the fondamenta in the direction of the storehouse, which is located about 100 yards further down the canal. The distance is not great, and the walk would take only 2 or 3 minutes if you were to move at a normal pace. But you do not move at a normal pace. You move slowly because there is no reason to hurry, and because the act of walking itself is something to be noticed and felt rather than simply accomplished. The first step you take places your right foot on a stone that has a distinct crescent-shaped crack running across its surface. The crack has been there since before you came to this island, and it has not grown wider in all the years you have walked over it. Your shoe is made of soft leather with a thin wooden sole, and you can feel the slight depression of the crack through the sole as your weight settles onto the stone. The sensation is familiar, and it is one of the small markers that tell you where you are on the path without needing to look down. The second step brings your left foot onto a stone that is smoother than the others and which has a faint polish to its surface from the passage of many feet over many decades. This stone is positioned directly in front of the small window that looks into the furnace room, and as you pass it, you can feel the warmth that radiates through the brick wall and out across the fondamenta. The warmth is not strong and it does not reach more than a foot or two from the wall, but it is noticeable as a slight change in the temperature of the air against your cheek. You pause for a moment, and you look through the window, which is set with the same small round panes of greenish glass that you see from the inside. Through the distortion of the glass, you can make out the orange glow of the furnace and the dark shape of Lorenzo moving slowly in front of it. He is holding a blowpipe, and he is turning it steadily in his hands, and the shape of the movement is like the turning of a wheel that never stops. You continue walking, and the warmth of the window fades behind you, and the air returns to the cool dampness of the autumn morning. The next section of the fondamenta is bordered on the right by a high brick wall that separates the furnace property from the narrow alley that leads to the main square of the island. The wall is made of bricks that are a soft terracotta color, and each brick is slightly different in shade from its neighbors because they were fired in different batches and at different temperatures. The mortar between the bricks is a pale sandy color, and it has been applied in a pattern that leaves a slight recess between each course of bricks. On the surface of this wall there is a growth of pale green lichen that spreads in irregular patches across the brickwork. The lichen is a living thing that grows so slowly that its progress cannot be seen from one day to the next. It has been on this wall for many years, and it has formed shapes that resemble maps of islands or the branching patterns of river deltas seen from a great height. The color of the lichen is a soft, muted green that is almost gray in the dimmer light of the morning. When you reach out and touch it with the tips of your fingers, the surface feels dry and slightly rough like very fine sandpaper. You withdraw your hand and you continue walking, and the lichen recedes behind you as you move along the wall. The stones beneath your feet change again, and now you're walking on a section of the fondamenta that has been repaired at some point in the past with stones that do not match the originals. These newer stones are more rectangular and their edges are sharper, and they have been set in a more regular pattern. The color is a uniform grey with none of the variation that marks the older stones. You notice this difference each time you walk this path, and it is a small reminder that the island is not frozen in time, but is constantly being patched and repaired and adjusted to the needs of the people who live here. You are now approximately halfway to the storehouse, and you stop walking, and you turn to face the canal. The water of the Rio dei Vetri is a few feet below the level of the fondamenta, and it is moving very slowly in the direction of the main lagoon. The tide is low at this hour, and you can see the stone steps that lead down from the walkway into the water. There are 6 steps in total, and the bottom 3 are submerged even at low tide because the water level in the canals of Venice is always at least a foot or two above the lowest step. The steps are made of the same grey stone as the older sections of the fondamenta, and they are worn smooth in the center where countless feet have passed over them. Because the tide is low, you can see the line where the water usually sits when the tide is high. This line is marked by a band of darker staining on the stone, and by a fringe of green algae that grows in the zone that is alternately wet and dry. Below the low tide line, the steps are covered with a dense layer of barnacles. The barnacles are small, and their shells are a pale greyish-white colour with tiny ridges that radiate out from the centre of each one. When the tide is high and the steps are covered, these barnacles are invisible, and they simply exist beneath the surface, doing whatever it is that barnacles do. But at low tide, they are exposed to the air, and they wait patiently for the water to return. Some of them have closed their shells tightly to preserve the moisture inside, and others are slightly open, with a tiny gap that reveals the dark interior. You look at the barnacles for a long moment, and you notice that they are not distributed evenly across the steps. They cluster more thickly in the areas where the stone has small pits and indentations that provide a better grip for their attachment. The smooth areas of the steps have fewer barnacles, and those that have managed to attach there are smaller and seem more precarious. The water laps gently at the lowest visible step, and each small wave sends a thin sheet of water up across the barnacles before retreating back down again. The sound of this movement is a soft, wet sigh that repeats every few seconds. You turn away from the canal, and you resume your walk along the fondamenta. The wall on your right continues, and the lichen continues with it in its slow spread across the bricks. You pass a doorway that leads into a small courtyard, and the door is closed and there is no sound from within. You pass a window that is shuttered with wooden panels that have been painted a faded green colour, and the paint is peeling in small curls that look like the petals of a dried flower. You do not look into the window because it is not your business to look into the windows of others. The storehouse is now visible at the end of the fondamenta. It is a low building with a roof of terracotta tiles that slope down toward the canal. The walls are made of the same soft red brick as the wall you have been walking beside, and there is a single door that faces the fondamenta. This door is made of heavy dark wood, reinforced with iron straps that cross in a diagonal pattern. There are no windows in the storehouse because windows would let in the light and the damp air from the canal, and neither of these things is good for the glass that is stored inside. The only opening besides the door is a small vent near the roofline that is covered with a piece of pierced metal to keep out birds and rats. You stop in front of the door and you look at it carefully. The surface of the wood is weathered, and it has deep grain lines that run vertically from top to bottom. The iron straps are dark with age, and they have a faint pattern of rust that has been polished smooth by the occasional touch of a hand. In the center of the door, at about the height of your waist, there is a small circle of red wax pressed into the gap between the door and the frame. This is the seal that you placed there the previous evening before you returned to the house. The seal is made by melting a stick of red wax over a candle flame and letting it drip onto the wood, and then pressing a small metal stamp into the soft wax before it hardens. The stamp you use has the simple design of a single letter F, which stands for Foscari, and it was your husband's stamp, and now it is yours. You lean closer to the door, and you examine the seal with care. The wax is still intact, and it has not been cracked or disturbed. The edges of the seal are slightly uneven where the wax spread out when you press the stamp into it, and the imprint of the letter F is clear and deep. There is a small bubble in the wax near the top edge that was created when a tiny pocket of air was trapped as the wax cooled. This bubble is a detail that you remember from yesterday evening, and its presence confirms that the seal is the same one you placed, and not a replacement made by someone else. The door has not been opened, and no one has entered the storehouse since you locked it and sealed it at the end of the previous day. You reach into the pocket of your wool gown, and your fingers find the heavy iron key that rests there. The key is about 4 inches long, and it has a simple shape with a round bow at one end and a series of notches and teeth at the other. The iron is dark, and it has a slight oily feel from being handled so often. You take the key out of your pocket, and you hold it in your right hand, and you feel the weight of it and the coolness of the metal against your palm. The bow of the key has a small hole in the center, and through this hole there is a loop of leather cord that you sometimes wear around your wrist when you are carrying multiple items, but today the cord hangs loose. You do not insert the key into the lock because you do not need to open the door. The purpose of your walk was simply to verify that the seal remains unbroken and that the glass inside is still safe. The glass inside consists of several dozen finished pieces that have been packed into wooden crates lined with straw. There are goblets with slender stems and thin bowls that catch the light in a particular way. There are small mirrors that have been backed with a layer of mercury and tin that makes them reflect like still water. There are strings of beads in various colors that will be sent to the markets of Northern Europe. All of these items are the product of many hours of work by the master Lorenzo and the other men who work in the furnace. They are valuable, and they must be kept safe until the agent from the trading house arrives to inspect them and arrange for their transport. You stand for a moment longer in front of the door, and you listen to the sounds of the canal. A duck is swimming near the opposite bank, and it makes a soft quacking sound that is barely audible over the lap of the water. The duck paddles slowly, and it dips its head beneath the surface and then raises it again with a small shake that sends droplets of water flying. The ripples from its movement spread outward in circles that grow wider and flatter until they disappear against the stone banks. You watch the duck for a while, and then it swims under a low arch of a small bridge further down the canal, and it is gone from sight. You turn away from the storehouse door, and you begin the walk back along the fondamenta toward the furnace office. The return journey is the same as the outward journey, but in reverse, and the details that you noticed on the way here appear again in a different order. First you pass the wall with the pale green lichen, and you see it from the other direction, and the shapes of the lichen patches look slightly different from this angle. Then you pass the section of newer grey stones, and you feel the sharper edges through the soles of your shoes. Then you come to the spot where the warmth from the furnace window reaches the fondamenta, and you feel the slight change in the air again. And finally you step onto the crescent crack stone and then onto the smooth polished stone, and then you are standing once more in front of the office door. The walk has taken perhaps 10 minutes in total, and during that time nothing of great consequence has occurred. The seal on the storehouse door remains unbroken, and the glass inside remains undisturbed. The lichen on the wall continues its slow growth, and the barnacles on the canal steps wait for the tide to return. The duck has swum under the bridge and is now somewhere else on the island, doing whatever ducks do when they are not being watched. The morning light is still grey, and the air is still cool, and the sound of the furnace is still a constant low hum behind the brick wall. You open the office door and you step back inside, and you close the door behind you. The room is exactly as you left it, with the ledgers on the desk and the quill in its pot of sand and the ink drying slowly in the shallow dish. You sit down on the stool, and you place the iron key back into your pocket, and you feel it settle against the fold of paper that contains your list of items to order. The key is warm now from being held in your hand, and it will gradually cool again as it rests in the darkness of the pocket. You look out of the small window and you see that the fishing boat from earlier has returned and is now moving in the opposite direction across the lagoon. The same man is standing at the stern, and he is pushing the same long oar through the same grey water. The gulls are still standing on the channel posts, and they have not moved since you last looked at them. The water stretches away to the distant smudge of Venice, and nothing has changed, and nothing will change for some time. You rest your hands on the desk, and you wait for the next thing that needs to be done, and the morning continues to pass in its quiet and uneventful way. The main ledger and the fuel ledger and the crucible ledger have all been put away in their proper places on the shelf beside the desk. You have reached now for a fourth book that sits on a lower shelf where the light from the window does not often fall. This book is thinner than the others, and its cover is made of a soft, flexible leather that has been dyed a deep oxblood red, which has faded over time to a dull brownish maroon. The edges of the pages are stained from the oils of many fingers, and the corners of the cover are curled upward slightly from being carried under arms and tucked into baskets. This is the order book for the commissary, which are the small glass beads that have made the island of Murano famous in every port from London to Constantinople. You place the book on the desk, and you open it to the section that concerns the current month. The pages here are divided into columns that are similar to those in the main ledger, but the headings are different, because the business of beads is measured not in ducats and soldi alone, but also in weight, and in the number of individual pieces, and in the length of the finished strands. The headings read peso for weight, color for color, forma for shape, and numero di massi for the number of bundles. The ink used for these headings is a faded brown that has bled slightly into the fibers of the paper, and the letters have a softer look than the sharp lines of the main ledger. The contrary are produced not inside the main furnace, but in the small workshops and homes of the women who live on the island. This is a separate trade from the blowing of goblets and mirrors, and it requires a different set of skills and a different kind of patience. The women work with thin rods of coloured glass that have been drawn out into long, flexible canes by the furnace workers. They cut these canes into tiny segments, and then they place the segments into a mixture of fine sand and powdered charcoal inside a small iron pan. The pan is heated over a lamp flame, and the woman turns it slowly with a steady hand until the sharp edges of the cut glass soften and round into perfect small spheres. The process takes many hours for each batch, and the women do this work in their own homes, sitting by a window where the light is good and the smoke from the lamp can escape through a gap in the shutters. You are not one of the women who makes the beads, and you do not know exactly how the softening of the edges is achieved. Your role is to receive the finished strands from the women, and to weigh them, and to record them in this book, and to prepare them for shipment to the merchants who will take them across the mountains to the cities of the north. The women bring their work to you once each week, usually on a Thursday afternoon, and they stand at a respectful distance just outside the office door while you weigh each bundle on a small brass scale that sits on a shelf near the window. This week the women have brought a particularly large quantity of beads because an order has come from the German trading house for a shipment to be sent to Nuremberg before the winter closes the mountain passes. The order is written on a piece of heavy paper that is folded into a square and tucked between the pages of the bead ledger. You take out this paper and you unfold it carefully and you smooth it flat on the desk next to the open book. The order is written in a neat hand with dark ink, and it lists the types and quantities of beads that the German merchant wishes to receive. The list begins with the simplest and most common bead, which is the Conteria Bianca, a small round bead of clear glass that has a faint bluish tint when held up to the light. These beads are used for rosaries and for the decoration of clothing, and they are sold by the thousands in every market in Europe. The order calls for 20 massi of the white beads, and each masso consists of 10 strands tied together at one end with a piece of cotton thread. Each strand is approximately 1 Venetian braccio in length, which is about 2 feet, and it contains roughly 200 individual beads threaded onto a thin wire that has been coated with a layer of tin to prevent rust. The total number of white beads in 20 bundles is therefore something close to 40,000 individual pieces, and the thought of this number is large enough to feel abstract and distant, like the number of stars that are said to exist in the sky. You open the drawer at the side of the desk, and you take out the small brass scale. The scale has 2 shallow pans that hang from a horizontal beam by thin chains made of the same brass metal. The beam is marked with a series of small notches that indicate different weights, and there is a sliding counterweight that can be moved along the beam to find the balance point. The scale is old, and the brass has a warm golden color that has been darkened by handling over many years. You place the scale on the desk, and you make sure that the pans hang level and that the beam moves freely without sticking. The bundles of white beads are stored in a shallow wooden box that sits on the floor beside the desk. You lift the box onto the desk, and you remove the lid, which is a simple piece of thin wood that rests on top without any hinges or fastenings. Inside the box, the bundles of beads are arranged in neat rows, and each bundle is tied with a loop of white thread that has been knotted 3 times. The glass of the beads catches the light from the window, and it glints with a soft pearly sheen that is almost white, but not quite. There is a faint bluish undertone that comes from the particular composition of the glass mixture, and this undertone is considered a mark of quality because it means that the glass is pure and free of the greenish tint that comes from iron impurities. You take one bundle from the box, and you hold it in your hand, and you feel the slight weight of the glass beads as they shift against each other. The surface of each bead is smooth and cool, and they make a soft clicking sound when they move. You place the bundle on one pan of the brass scale, and you slide the counterweight along the beam until the 2 pans hang level. The weight of one bundle of white beads is approximately 4 Venetian ounces, which is 1/4 of the pound. 20 bundles will therefore weigh 5 Venetian pounds, and this is the weight you will record in the ledger under the column marked peso. You write the entry for the white beads in the order book. Bianca tonda 20 massi peso 5 libbre. You write, and the ink flows from the quill in a thin, steady line. The letters are small and neat, and they fit comfortably within the ruled columns. You pause and you look at what you have written, and then you set the quill down, and you return the bundle of white beads to the wooden box. The next item on the order from Nuremberg is for beads that are called rosetta, which means little rose. These beads are more difficult to make because they are composed of multiple layers of glass in different colors that have been fused together before the cane is drawn out. The finished bead has a cross-section that shows a pattern of concentric rings with a center of white or yellow, surrounded by rings of red and green and blue. The effect when the bead is held in the light is of a tiny flower blooming inside the glass, and this is why they are called little roses. The German merchant has requested only 5 mazzi of the rosetta beads because they are more expensive and because they are used for the finer sort of jewelry that is worn by wealthy women on special occasions. You take a bundle of the rosetta beads from a separate compartment in the wooden box. These beads are larger than the white beads, and they are strung on a thicker wire that has been coated with silver rather than tin. The colors are muted in the grey light of the office, but you can still make out the pattern of rings inside each bead. The red is a deep rusty color that comes from the addition of copper to the glass mixture, and the green is a soft sage color that comes from iron, and the blue is a pale watery color that comes from cobalt. The combination of these colors is pleasing to the eye in a quiet way that does not demand attention but rewards it when given. You weigh the bundle of rosetta beads on the brass scale, and you find that each bundle weighs slightly more than the white bundles because the beads themselves are larger and because the wire is heavier. The weight is 5 ounces per bundle, and so 5 bundles will weigh a total of 25 ounces, which is just over 1.5 Venetian pounds. You write the entry in the order book, Rosetta 5 mazzi peso una libra e 9 onzi, and you place the bundle back in its compartment. The third item on the German order is a request for beads that are called a lume, which means made by the lamp. These are the beads that require the most skill and the most time, because each one is shaped individually by hand, using a small flame from an oil lamp. The woman who makes these beads holds a thin rod of colored glass in one hand and a pointed tool in the other, and she heats the end of the rod in the flame until it softens, and then she uses the tool to shape the soft glass into a tiny flower or a leaf or a small animal. The most common form is a simple 4-petaled flower made of white glass with a dot of yellow in the center. These beads are called firate, and they are used as decorations on the ends of silk cords and on the fringes of altar cloths in churches. The order calls for 200 individual firate beads, and they are not strung on wires like the other beads, but are kept loose in a small cloth bag that is tied with a drawstring. You take the bag from the box, and you open it carefully, and you pour a small number of the beads onto the palm of your hand. They are tiny things, each one no larger than a small pea, and yet each one is a complete flower, with 4 distinct petals and a central dot. The glass is a milky white color that is slightly translucent, and the yellow center is bright and opaque. You count out 10 of the beads, and you weigh them, and then you multiply the weight to arrive at the total for 200. The total weight is very small, only about 2 ounces for the entire quantity, and you record this in the book. Fiorate 200 peso di onzi. You continue through the order, and you record the remaining items one by one. There are beads called Nair, a simple black bead made by adding manganese to the glass, and these are requested in a quantity of 30 mazzi for use in mourning jewelry. There are beads called Verdi, a green bead that is the color of new leaves in spring, and these are requested in a quantity of 10 mazzi. There are beads called Azur, a blue bead that is the color of the sky on a clear winter morning, and these are requested in a quantity of 8 mazzi. And finally there are beads called Gial, a yellow bead that is made with the addition of silver compounds to the glass, and which has a warm golden color that glows even in low light. These are the most expensive of the simple beads, and the order requests only 3 mazzi. As you write each entry, you can hear in the distance the faint sound of the women working in their homes along the canals. The sound is not loud enough to be distinct, but it is a constant background texture to the day, like the hum of the furnace and the lap of the water. The sound of the bead making is the sound of small metal tools tapping against glass, and the soft hiss of the oil lamp flames, and the occasional voice of a woman calling to a child or to a neighbor. These sounds are so familiar that you do not consciously notice them most of the time, but when you sit in the quiet of the office with the door closed, they are present at the edge of your awareness, like a thread that runs through the fabric of the island's life. When you have finished recording all of the items from the German order, you close the bead ledger and you place it back on the shelf. The wooden box of beads remains on the desk, and you will need to pack the bundles into a shipping barrel before the end of the week. The barrel will be lined with a layer of soft wool cloth to prevent the glass from rubbing against itself during the journey over the mountains. The barrel will be sealed with wax and marked with the stamp of the furnace, and then it will be loaded onto a barge and taken across the lagoon to the warehouse of the German trading house near the Rialto Bridge. From there it will travel by river and by road across the Alps to the city of Nuremberg, where a merchant will open it and count the bundles and check them against the order, and then sell them to the craftsmen who make rosaries and jewelry and decorated clothing. You think about this journey for a moment, and you imagine the barrel moving slowly across the lagoon on a flat barge with the water slapping against the wooden hull. You imagine it being lifted by ropes onto a cart pulled by mules, and the cart creaking along a road that winds through mountain passes where the air is thin and cold. You imagine the merchant in Nuremberg opening the barrel in a room that looks different from this room, with different light coming through different windows and different sounds in the air. And then you stop imagining because the barrel is still here on Murano, and the journey has not yet begun, and there is no need to think about it until the day of shipment arrives. You look out of the small window and you see that the grey light of the morning has shifted slightly toward a paler shade that suggests the sun is higher now behind the clouds. The lagoon is still flat and still, and the distant shape of Venice is still a smudge on the horizon. Nothing has changed outside and nothing has changed inside except that the entries in the bead ledger has been written and the weight of the bundles has been recorded, and the order from Nuremberg is one step closer to being fulfilled. You sit for a while longer with your hands resting on the desk, and you listen to the distant sound of the women making beads and the nearer sound of the furnace humming through the wall. The wool shawl around your shoulders has slipped again, and you pull it back into place, and you feel the familiar weight of it against your neck. The day is moving forward, and the work of the morning is nearly complete. There is a small satisfaction in the neat columns of numbers and the careful descriptions of colors and shapes, but it is a satisfaction that is soft and muted, like the colors of the beads themselves in the grey light of the office. You close your eyes for a moment and you listen to the sounds of the island, and you wait for the next thing that will need your attention. The ledgers have been closed and placed back on the shelf, and the office is tidy, with the quill in its pot of sand and the ink dish covered with a small piece of slate to keep the dust from settling on the surface. You stand up from the stool and you feel the slight release of pressure in your lower back as your spine straightens. The wool shawl has slipped down over one shoulder and you adjust it so that it sits evenly across both shoulders with the ends hanging down over your chest. The shawl is a plain weave of undyed wool that is the natural color of the sheep from which it came. A soft brownish grey with flecks of darker fiber scattered throughout. You have worn this shawl for many years, and it has taken on the shape of your body so that it sits comfortably without needing to be arranged. You open the door that leads from the office into the main room of the furnace, and you step across the threshold. The change in the air is immediate and complete. The office air was cool and still, and carried the faint smell of paper and ink and old leather. The furnace room air is warm and moving, and it carries a complex mixture of scents that include hot brick dust, and the sharp mineral smell of melting glass, and the sweetish odor of burning beechwood, and the faint metallic tang of the iron tools that hang on the wall. The warmth presses against your face and your hands, and you feel it through the wool of your gown and your shawl. It is not an uncomfortable warmth because you are not standing close to the fire, but it is a noticeable presence that reminds you constantly of the great heat that lives on the other side of the brick archway. The furnace room is a large space with a high ceiling that is lost in shadow because the only light comes from the fire itself and from a few small windows set high in the walls. The floor is made of packed earth mixed with crushed brick, and it has been worn into shallow depressions where the workers stand most often. The walls are the same soft red brick as the outside of the building, but here they are darkened by years of smoke and soot, so that the original color is only visible in the deepest crevices where the cleaning brush cannot reach. The air has a slight haze to it from the smoke that escapes when the furnace door is opened, and this haze softens the edges of everything so that the room seems larger and more indistinct than it really is. You walk slowly across the room toward the wooden stool that sits against the wall at a safe distance from the main furnace opening. The stool is a simple object made of 3 stout legs and a round seat that has been carved from a single piece of beechwood. The surface of the seat is polished smooth by the passage of many bodies sitting and shifting and leaning over the years, and it has a warm golden brown color that glows faintly in the light from the fire. You sit down on the stool and you arrange your gown so that it falls neatly over your knees, and you place your hands in your lap, one on top of the other. The stool is positioned so that you can see the main furnace opening and the annealing layer and the workbench where the master Lorenzo shapes the glass, but you are far enough away that the heat does not become oppressive. The furnace itself is a large brick structure that occupies most of the far wall. It has 3 openings that are visible from where you sit. The first and largest is the main melting chamber, where the crucibles of molten glass sit in a bath of intense, white-hot fire. This opening is closed most of the time by a thick door made of firebrick that is moved into place with a long iron rod. When the door is open, the light that pours out is almost too bright to look at directly, and it casts sharp black shadows across the room. The second opening is the glory hole, which is a smaller round aperture that is kept open during the working hours so that the glassmaker can reheat the glass on his blowpipe as it cools during the shaping process. The glory hole glows with a steady orange light that flickers only slightly when the bellows are worked. The third opening is the mouth of the annealing layer, which is a long horizontal tunnel that extends away from the main furnace and gradually cools over a distance of about 15 feet. The annealing layer is the focus of your attention on this afternoon because it is here that the finished glass spends many hours cooling from the intense heat of the furnace to the temperature of the outside air. This cooling process is the most delicate part of the entire glassmaking art, because if the glass cools too quickly, it will develop internal stresses that will cause it to shatter at the slightest touch, sometimes days or weeks after it has been made. The glass must cool slowly and evenly so that all of its parts contract at the same rate, and the invisible tensions within the material are released gently over time. The layer accomplishes this by providing a long tunnel that is hottest at the end nearest the furnace, and gradually cooler at the far end where the finished pieces are removed. You watch as one of the younger workers, a boy of perhaps 14 years, approaches the far end of the layer with a long iron tool that has a flat blade at the end. The boy is wearing a simple tunic of coarse linen that has been patched in several places, and his face is smudged with soot, and his hands are wrapped in strips of cloth to protect them from the heat. He opens a small door at the end of the tunnel, and he peers inside, and then he reaches in with the flat blade of his tool, and he carefully slides out a single finished goblet. The goblet is still warm enough that you can see a faint shimmer of heat rising from its surface, but it is cool enough to be handled with the cloth-wrapped hands. The boy examines the goblet, briefly holding it up to the light from a small window, and then he places it on a wooden rack that stands against the wall where a dozen other pieces are already cooling further. The boy then takes a new piece that has just been finished by the master Lorenzo, and he carries it carefully to the near end of the layer where the temperature is highest. He opens another small door, and he slides the piece inside using the same flat-bladed tool. And then he closes the door and returns to his position near the far end to wait for the next piece to emerge. The journey of each piece through the layer takes approximately 8 hours, and during that time, the temperature drops from the melting point of glass down to a point where the glass is solid and stable and can be handled without special tools. The boy's task is simply to remove the cooled pieces and insert the hot pieces, and then wait for the passage of time to do its work. The sound in the furnace room is a complex layering of different tones and rhythms. The deepest sound is the constant low roar of the fire in the main melting chamber, a sound that is felt in the chest as much as it is heard by the ears. Above this there is the rhythmic sighing of the bellows, which are worked by another boy who stands at a large wooden lever on the opposite side of the furnace. The bellows are made of thick leather stretched over a wooden frame, and they are connected to the furnace by a clay pipe that directs the blast of air into the base of the fire. The boy pushes down on the lever, and the bellows expand with a long inhaling sound, and then he releases the lever, and a heavy stone weight pulls the bellows closed with a long exhaling sound that sends a rush of air into the fire. This cycle repeats every few seconds, and it has been repeating for so long that the sound has become a kind of heartbeat for the entire building. The master Lorenzo is working at the bench near the glory hole, and you watch him from your stool on the far side of the room. He is a man of middle age with broad shoulders and large hands that are covered with a network of fine white scars from years of accidental contact with hot glass. His face is reddened and weathered by the constant exposure to the heat, and his eyes are protected by a pair of simple spectacles with thick green lenses that reduce the glare of the glowing glass. He is holding a blowpipe in his hands, and he is turning it slowly and steadily so that the gather of molten glass on the end does not sag or drip. The blowpipe is a long iron tube about 5 feet in length, and it is hollow so that the glassmaker can blow air through it to inflate the hot glass into a bubble. Lorenzo has been working on a set of drinking glasses for a noble family in Padua, and he is now at the stage where the basic shape of the bowl has been formed, and he is adding a thin trail of colored glass around the rim. The colored glass is a deep cobalt blue that has been prepared in a separate small crucible, and he gathers a tiny amount of it onto the end of a pointed iron rod. He touches the blue glass to the rim of the goblet, and he turns the blowpipe slowly so that the blue glass winds around the rim in a continuous spiral. The motion of his hands is smooth and unhurried, and it comes from years of repetition that have made the movement automatic. He does not look at his hands while he works, because his eyes are fixed on the point where the blue glass meets the clear glass, and he is watching the way the two materials flow together. You watch Lorenzo work, and you do not speak to him, because there is no need for words. He knows that you are there on the stool, and he knows that you are watching, and this is enough. The relationship between the person who keeps the books and the person who makes the glass is a relationship of parallel work rather than direct collaboration. You ensure that the materials arrive and that the finished pieces are accounted for, and Lorenzo ensures that the fire stays hot and the glass takes shape. The two rolls touch only at the edges, and for the most part they proceed independently like two boats moving on parallel courses across the lagoon. The boy at the bellows continues his steady rhythm, and the boy at the lyre continues his slow patrol from one end to the other. The fire in the main chamber shifts slightly in color from a roaring yellow to a deeper orange as Lorenzo reduces the airflow for a moment while he concentrates on the delicate rim of the goblet. The color of the flame is a language that the glassmakers read as easily as you read the numbers in your ledgers. A yellow flame means too much air and a temperature that is higher than necessary. A blue flame means not enough air and a temperature that is too low for proper melting. The ideal flame for most of the work is a soft orange that glows evenly without flickering. You sit on the stool and you let your gaze drift around the room, taking in the small details that are always present but not always noticed. The walls near the furnace are covered with a layer of black soot that is thick and velvety, and when a draft moves through the room, small flakes of this soot lift into the air and drift slowly downward, like snow made of ash. The iron tools that hang on the wall have a dark patina that is the result of years of heating and cooling and contact with molten glass, and the patina has a faint rainbow sheen in the areas where the metal has been repeatedly heated. The floor beneath the bench where Lorenzo works is littered with small fragments of glass that have fallen from the blowpipe or broken off during the shaping process. These fragments are of many colors and they catch the light from the fire and glitter, faintly like tiny stars scattered across the dark earth. Above the bench there is a wooden beam that runs across the ceiling, and this beam is darkened with age and smoke like everything else in the room. But there is one small area on the underside of this beam near the end closest to the office door that is slightly lighter in color than the surrounding wood. This lighter patch is where your husband used to rest his hand when he stood in this room and watched Lorenzo work. Your husband was not a tall man, and he would stand with his right hand raised and his palm flat against the beam, while he leaned forward slightly to observe the progress of a particular piece. Over the years, the oils from his hand and the slight friction of his palm against the wood wore away a thin layer of the soot and revealed the paler wood beneath. You look at this patch on the beam, and you notice that it is still there. It has not been covered over by new soot, because the soot settles slowly, and the patch is on the underside of the beam where the rising smoke does not easily reach. The patch is about the size of a man's hand, with the fingers slightly spread, and it has the faint shape of a palm and 5 ovals where the fingertips pressed. You look at this mark and you remember the way your husband's hand looked when he came back from the furnace room at the end of the day. His hands were always clean, because he was not a glassmaker himself, but they carried the smell of the furnace and of the particular soap he used to wash away the soot that settled on his skin, even though he did not work directly with the fire. That soap was made from olive oil and the ash of certain sea plants, and it had a clean, sharp scent that was unlike anything else in the furnace building. The scent was a mixture of the oil's richness and the ash's dryness, and it lingered on his hands even after he had washed them several times. When he sat at the desk in the office and opened the ledgers, the scent of the soap would rise faintly from his hands as he turned the pages, and you would smell it from across the room. The scent is no longer present in the office because you have not used that particular soap since the spring. But standing here in the furnace room and looking at the mark on the beam, you can almost recall the scent in your memory as a ghost of a smell that exists only in the mind. The boy at the lair opens the far door again and removes another goblet. This one is slightly different in shape, with a wider bowl and a shorter stem, and it was made for a different order from a different family. The boy places it on the rack next to the others, and then he returns to his waiting position. The goblets on the rack are cooling further now that they are out of the lair, and their surfaces are losing the faint shimmer of heat and becoming clear and still. When they are fully cool, they will be taken to the storehouse and placed in the wooden crates with the straw packing, and the door will be sealed with red wax. The light in the furnace room has changed almost imperceptibly as the afternoon advances. The small windows set high in the walls show a sky that is still grey, but a slightly deeper grey than it was in the morning. The fire in the furnace seems brighter now against the darkening room, and the shadows have grown longer and softer. Lorenzo has finished the goblet with the blue rim, and he has placed it on the end of a long iron rod and handed it to the boy, who will slide it into the near end of the lair. Lorenzo is now wiping his hands on a piece of cloth, and he is looking at the crucibles in the main chamber to assess how much glass remains for the rest of the day's work. You remain on the stool, and you continue to watch the room and to listen to the sounds of the fire and the bellows and the quiet movements of the workers. The warmth of the furnace has seeped through your gown and your shawl, and it has reached your skin so that you feel a pleasant drowsiness that comes from sitting still in a warm place. You do not fight this drowsiness because there is no reason to be fully alert at this moment. The ledgers are closed and the beads are counted, and the seal on the storehouse is intact. The afternoon is a time for watching and waiting and letting the slow rhythms of the furnace carry the hours forward. The boy at the bellows pauses for a moment, and he wipes his forehead with the back of his hand, and then he resumes the steady pushing and releasing of the lever. The sound of the bellows fills the room again, and the fire responds with a slight brightening of its orange glow. Lorenzo has picked up a fresh blowpipe, and he is preparing to gather more glass from the crucible for the next piece. The cycle continues, and it will continue until the evening, when the fires are banked and the tools are cleaned and the workers go home to their own houses along the canals. You will remain on the stool for a while longer, watching the slow fire do its patient work of cooling and shaping and transforming the sand and ash and pebbles into objects that will travel across the sea and the mountains to sit on tables in distant cities. And when the light through the high windows has faded enough that the fire is the only source of illumination, you will rise from the stool and return to the office and close the door behind you, leaving the furnace room to its heat and its glow and its quiet, endless hum. The door between the furnace room and the office closes behind you with a soft sound of wood meeting wood, and the iron latch falling into its catch. The office is dim now, because the light through the small window has faded from grey to a deeper shade that is almost to charcoal. The objects in the room are visible only as shapes rather than distinct things. The bulk of the desk, the pale rectangle of the closed ledger on its shelf, the dark vertical line of the quill standing in its pot of sand. You do not light a candle yet because there is enough light to move by, and because the darkness of the room is a gentle transition from the brightness of the furnace fire to the quiet of the evening. You walk across the office, and you open a second door that is set into the wall opposite the one that leads to the furnace room. This door is narrower, and it is made of a lighter wood that has been painted a faded blue color many years ago. The paint is chipped in places, and the bare wood beneath shows through as pale patches shaped like the continents on a map. The door swings inward on small iron hinges that do not creak because you oiled them with a drop of lamp oil at the beginning of the autumn. You step through the doorway, and you're in the house where you live. The house is a small space consisting of 2 rooms arranged one behind the other. The first room is where you cook and eat and sit in the evenings, and the second room beyond it is where you sleep. The walls are plastered and whitewashed, and the plaster has small cracks that radiate from the corners of the windows like the veins on a dried leaf. The floor is made of the same wide larch planks as the office floor, but here they are covered in the center of the room by a woven rush mat that softens the sound of footsteps. The ceiling is low, and it is crossed by 3 heavy beams that are dark with age and smoke from the small hearth. The hearth is set into the wall to your left, and it is a simple structure made of brick with a stone shelf above it where a few objects are arranged. There is a small iron pot, a clay jug with a chipped rim, a wooden box that contains a block of dried salt, and a bundle of dried herbs that hang from a nail and release a faint, dusty fragrance when the warmth of a fire reaches them. No fire burns in the hearth now because the evening is not cold enough to require it, and because the warmth from the furnace wall which is shared with this room seeps through the bricks and keeps the house at a comfortable temperature, even without a flame. You walk to the hearth and you reach up to the stone shelf and you take down the wooden board that rests there. The board is a simple rectangle of beechwood about the length of your forearm, and it has been worn smooth on one side by the repeated passage of a knife blade. The surface is marked with many fine scratches that form a pattern, like the grain of the wood itself, but running in different directions. You place the board on the small table that stands in the center of the room. The table is made of the same dark walnut as the desk in the office, and it has a single drawer that contains a few spoons and a cloth for wiping. You walk next to a small cupboard that stands against the wall near the door to the sleeping room. The cupboard is painted the same faded blue as the door, and it has 2 shelves inside. On the upper shelf there is a loaf of bread that was baked 3 days ago by the woman who lives 3 houses down the fondamenta. The bread is a round rustic loaf with a thick crust that is the color of pale terracotta, and it is wrapped loosely in a piece of undyed linen cloth. You take the loaf from the cupboard and you carry it to the table and you place it beside the wooden board. The cloth falls away and the bread sits on the table with its round domed shape and its crust that has small blisters where the heat of the oven causes the surface to bubble slightly. You take a knife from the drawer of the table. The knife has a wooden handle that is dark with age and a blade that is made of iron with a curved edge that has been sharpened so many times that the metal is visibly thinner near the cutting edge than it is near the spine. You hold the loaf of bread steady with your left hand, and you position the knife at the top of the dome. You press down slowly and the crust resists for a moment, and then it yields with a soft cracking sound that is both sharp and muted. The blade sinks through the crust and into the softer interior, and you continue to press until the knife meets the board beneath. You have cut a slice from the loaf and it falls away onto the board, revealing the pale cream-colored interior of the bread, with its small irregular holes that were formed by the yeast as it rose. The slice of bread is about the thickness of your smallest finger, and it is slightly uneven because the loaf itself is not perfectly symmetrical. One edge is a little thicker than the other, and the crust along that edge forms a slight ridge. You pick up the slice and you place it on a smaller wooden plate that sits on the table, and you wrap the remaining loaf back in the linen cloth and return it to the cupboard. The bread will last for several more days, and it will become progressively drier and harder until the last of it is soaked in broth or toasted over the coals. You sit down on a wooden chair that is pulled up to the table. The chair has a straight back and a seat that has been carved with a shallow depression to make sitting more comfortable. The legs are uneven, and there is a small folded piece of leather wedged under one of them to stop it from rocking. You sit and you look at the slice of bread on the plate, and you reach for a second object that sits on the table. A small ceramic jar with a cork stopper. The jar is glazed on the inside, and the outside is a plain unglazed terracotta that is cool and slightly rough to the touch. Inside the jar there is olive oil that came from a grove in the hills of the Marche region on the eastern side of the Italian peninsula. You remove the cork and you pour a small amount of the oil into a shallow dish that sits beside the jar. The oil moves slowly because it is cool, and it has a thick golden green color that catches the last faint light from the window. The surface of the oil in the dish is perfectly smooth, and it reflects the dim room as a distorted miniature image of the table and your hands and the whitewashed wall behind you. The smell of the oil rises from the dish, and it is a clean smell that has a hint of grass and a faint peppery note at the end. You take the slice of bread in your hands, and you tear off a small piece. The tearing makes a soft sound as the crumb separates and a few tiny crumbs fall onto the plate. You dip the piece of bread into the oil and you hold it there for a moment so that the bread absorbs a small amount. Then you lift it to your mouth and you eat it slowly. The taste is simple and familiar. The mild sweetness of the bread and the rich smoothness of the oil and the slight saltiness that comes from the salt you added to the oil when you first poured it. You chew slowly, and you listen to the sounds of the evening. The first sound you notice is the bell from the church of Santa Maria e Donato. The church is not far from your house, and its bell tower rises above the rooftops of the island, and can be seen from the fondamenta when you walk toward the main square. The bell is ringing now to mark the hour of evening prayer, and the sound is a single deep note that repeats 3 times with a long pause between each repetition. The note hangs in the air after the bell has stopped moving, and it fades slowly into the other sounds of the evening. The ringing is not loud enough to be intrusive, but it is clear and distinct, and it serves as a marker of time for everyone on the island who does not have a clock. After the bell fades, you hear the sound of the lagoon through the small window that faces the water. The sound is different in the evening than it is during the day. During the day, there is the constant background noise of boats moving and workers calling, and the general activity of an island where glass is made and traded. In the evening, the boat traffic diminishes and the voices fade, and what remains is the pure sound of the water itself. The tide is turning now, and the water is moving in a slow, sustained surge against the stone embankments, with a sound that is like a long exhale followed by a pause and then another exhale. This sound has been the same for as long as the island has existed, and it will continue long after the current inhabitants are gone. The third sound is the sound of the furnace, which is quieter now than it was during the working day. The fires have been banked for the night, which means that the airflow has been reduced and the wood has been arranged so that it will burn very slowly until morning. The roar of the main chamber has subsided to a low hum that is felt more than heard, and the bellows are silent because the boy has gone home. The furnace is never truly cold, because it takes too long to heat up again from a cold start, and so a small fire is kept alive through the night, feeding on the dense beechwood that burns for hours without needing attention. The sound of this banked fire is a soft whisper that passes through the brick wall and into your house, and it is a sound that you have heard every night for so many years that you would miss it if it were absent. The house itself is quiet, and you sit at the table and you eat the bread and oil piece by piece. The light from the window has faded further, and the room is now lit only by the faint glow that comes through the gaps in the shutters from the last of the twilight outside. The objects in the room have lost their colors, and they appear in shades of grey and black. The whitewashed walls are a pale grey, and the wooden beams are a deep charcoal, and the terracotta jar is a dark shape against the lighter wall. Your own hands are visible as pale shapes moving above the darker surface of the table. When you have eaten the last piece of bread, you pick up the plate and you wipe it with the cloth from the drawer, and you place it back on the shelf above the hearth. You pour the small amount of oil that remains in the shallow dish back into the jar, and you insert the cork stopper firmly. The jar goes back into the cupboard, and the cupboard door closes with a soft click. The wooden board is wiped clean and placed back on the stone shelf. The knife is returned to the drawer. The table is empty again, except for its own dark surface and the faint ring of moisture where the dish of oil sat. You walk to the window and you open the shutters a small crack so that you can see the lagoon. The water is a flat, dark grey that is almost black, and it reflects the faint light of the sky, which is a slightly lighter grey near the horizon. There are no boats moving, and the only visible lights are the distant pinpricks of candles in the windows of houses on the far side of the canal, and a single larger light that is the lantern on the bell tower of the church. The stars are not visible because the clouds are still thick overhead and they form a solid blanket that hides the sky. The air that comes through the crack in the shutters is cool and damp, and it carries the smell of the lagoon and the faint, distant scent of wood smoke from other furnaces on other parts of the island. You stand at the window for a while and you listen to the water, and you watch the darkness settle over the lagoon. The plague that is moving through the main city of Venice has changed the sound of the evening in ways that are subtle but noticeable. In ordinary times, there would be more boats moving at this hour as people returned home from work, or visited friends, or conducted small errands. The sound of oars and voices would carry across the water, and the lights of lanterns would bob and weave like fireflies. Now the lagoon is quieter, and the lights are fewer. The health authorities have discouraged unnecessary travel, and many people remain in their houses after dark. The silence is not a frightening silence because the plague is in Venice and not on Murano. At least not yet. It is simply a quieter version of the evening, with more space between the sounds and longer pauses in which only the water can be heard. You close the shutter and you turn back to the room. You walk to the small table near the door to the sleeping room, and you take up the candle that sits there in a simple iron holder. The candle is made of tallow which is rendered animal fat, and it is a pale yellowish-white color with a slight translucence near the top where the heat of previous flames has softened the material. The wick is a twisted piece of cotton that stands up from the center of the candle, and it is charred and bent at the tip from the last time it was extinguished. You carry the candle holder to the hearth, and you take a small piece of charred cloth from a box on the shelf. You strike a spark using a flint and a small piece of iron, and the spark catches on the charred cloth and glows orange. You touch the glowing cloth to the wick of the candle, and the wick catches, and a small flame appears. The flame is about the height of your thumbnail, and it is shaped like a teardrop, with a bright yellow center and a paler outer edge that is almost blue at the very bottom where it meets the wick. The flame flickers slightly with the movement of the air in the room, and it casts a warm, unsteady light that makes the shadows on the walls shift and dance. The light reaches only a few feet from the candle, and beyond that radius the room remains in darkness. You can see the table and the chair and the edge of the hearth, but the corners of the room are lost in shadow. You sit down at the table again, and you take a small pair of iron snuffers from the drawer. The snuffers are shaped like a pair of scissors, but the blades are replaced by a small box that closes over the wick to extinguish the flame without creating smoke. You do not use them yet because the candle is still burning, and you will let it burn for a while longer. You place the snuffers on the table next to the candle holder, and you look at the flame as it burns steadily. The tallow has a particular smell when it burns, a smell that is slightly meaty and slightly sweet, and it fills the small room with a presence that is not unpleasant but is distinctive. The smell of burning tallow is one of the oldest smells in human history, and it has lit the evenings of countless people in countless rooms for thousands of years. You watch the candle burn, and you listen to the furnace humming through the wall and the water lapping at the stones outside. The flame consumes the tallow slowly, and a small pool of liquid fat forms around the base of the wick. The wick itself glows red at the tip, and a thin stream of smoke rises from it and disappears into the darkness of the ceiling. The candle will burn for perhaps 2 hours before it needs to be extinguished or replaced, and that is more time than you need because you will not stay awake for 2 hours. The day has been long in the quiet way that days on Murano are long. You have written in the ledgers, and you have counted the wood, and you have walked along the fundamenta to check the seal on the storehouse. You have weighed the beads and recorded the order from Nuremberg. You have sat in the furnace room and watched the slow work of the glass and the patient cooling in the lair. Now you are in your house with the bread and oil and the candle and the sounds of the evening. There is nothing more that needs to be done today, and there is nothing that needs to be decided or resolved. The books are balanced, and the fire is banked, and the door is locked. You rise from the chair and you take the candle holder in your hand. The flame wavers with the movement and then steadies itself again. You walk to the door of the sleeping room and you push it open. The room beyond is small, and it contains a bed with a wooden frame and a mattress stuffed with straw that has been covered with a layer of wool. There is a small window set high in the wall, and it is shuttered from the outside so that no light enters. You place the candle holder on a small shelf near the bed, and you sit down on the edge of the mattress. The straw rustles softly beneath you, and the wool cover is rough against your palms. You remove your shoes, and you place them side by side on the floor next to the bed. You loosen the wool shawl from your shoulders, and you fold it once, and then twice, and you lay it across the foot of the bed where it will be within reach if the night grows cold. You lie down on the mattress, and you feel the straw shift to accommodate the shape of your body. The ceiling above you is lost in darkness, and the only light in the room is the small circle of warm glow from the candle on the shelf. You lie still and you listen to the sounds that have accompanied you to sleep every night for many years. The furnace hums its low, steady note through the wall at the head of the bed. The water moves against the stones outside the shuttered window. The candle flame makes a tiny sound that is almost too quiet to hear, a soft, continuous whisper of combustion. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, and then is silent. The bell in the church tower will ring again at the next hour, but you will be asleep by then. You reach over and you take the iron snuffers from the table where you left them earlier. You have carried them into the sleeping room without thinking about it because the motion is automatic. You open the small box of the snuffers and you position it over the candle flame. You close the snuffers gently, and the flame is extinguished instantly, with a small hiss and a thin curl of smoke that rises and then fades. The room is now completely dark, and the darkness is absolute, because there is no light from the window and no light from the other room. You place the snuffers on the shelf beside the candle holder, and you lie back on the mattress. The darkness is filled with the sounds of the night, and the sounds are the same as they have always been. The furnace hums and the water laps, and the house settles with small creaks that are the wood cooling and adjusting. You close your eyes, and the darkness behind your eyelids is the same as the darkness in the room. Your breathing slows and becomes regular, and the sounds of the island blend together into a single continuous presence that asks nothing of you and expects nothing from you. The day is over, and the books are closed, and the fire is banked, and the glass cools slowly in the lair. You let go of the day, and you allow the sounds to carry you down into sleep. And the house is quiet and still, and the lagoon outside the window continues its eternal patient movement against the stones. The morning light through the small office window is a pale silver color that seems to come from no particular direction. You have been sitting at the desk for perhaps half an hour, and you have opened the main ledger and made 2 small entries concerning the purchase of a new iron pontello and the receipt of a small barrel of manganese from the apothecary in Venice. The entries are written in your neat hand, and the ink has dried, and you have closed the ledger and placed it back on the shelf. The office is quiet except for the familiar sounds of the furnace next door and the water in the canal. A knock comes at the door that leads to the fondamenta. It is a single knock made with the back of a knuckle, and it is not loud. You rise from the stool, and you cross the room, and you open the door. Standing on the stones outside is a young man you recognize as a servant from the household of a noble family that owns a villa in the hills near Asolo. He is wearing a simple tunic of dark wool, and he holds a folded piece of paper in his hand. He does not step inside because the custom of distance is still observed, and he simply extends his arm and offers you the paper. You take it, and he nods once, and then he turns and walks away along the fondamenta in the direction of the main square. You close the door, and you return to the desk. You unfold the paper, and you smooth it flat. The message is written in a fine hand, with dark ink, and it is a request for flat glass panes to repair a broken window in the villa. The nobleman has fled the city of Venice due to the sickness, and he is residing in his country house where the air is said to be cleaner and the risk of contagion is lower. A branch fell from an old cypress tree during a storm, and it struck one of the windows of the main salon and shattered 3 of the small diamond-shaped panes that are set into the lead framework. The nobleman requests replacements of the same size and thickness, and he offers to pay the usual price plus a small additional sum for the urgency of the matter. You read the letter twice, and then you fold it and place it in the drawer of the desk. Flat glass is not the primary product of this furnace because the true art of Murano lies in the blowing of delicate goblets and the creation of mirrors and the drawing of beads. But every furnace on the island knows how to make flat glass when it is requested, because windows must be glazed and the city of Venice has many windows. The method used is called the cylinder method, and it is an old technique that requires patience and a steady hand and a certain amount of glass that would otherwise be used for other things. You rise from the desk and you walk through the door into the furnace room. The warmth of the fire meets you as it always does, and you take your usual place on the wooden stool against the wall. The master Lorenzo is at the bench, and he is finishing a small goblet with a twisted stem. You wait until he places the goblet on the end of the iron rod and hands it to the boy who will carry it to the lair. When his hands are free, you speak to him across the room, and you tell him about the order from the nobleman. 3 panes of flat glass in the diamond shape, each measuring approximately 6 inches on the side, and the thickness of a small coin. Lorenzo listens and he nods, and he does not speak, because there is no need for discussion. He knows how to make flat glass, and he will do it now. Lorenzo walks to the main furnace and he opens the small door of the glory hole. He selects a fresh blowpipe from the rack on the wall, and he checks the end of it to make sure it is clean and free of old glass. He inserts the end of the blowpipe into the glory hole, and he lets it heat for a few moments until the iron glows a dull red. Then he withdraws it, and he moves to the main melting chamber. The boy at the bellows increases the airflow slightly, and the fire brightens from orange to a paler yellow. Lorenzo opens the door of the main chamber, and the heat that pours out is intense, even at your distance across the room. The light is almost white, and it makes you squint for a moment until your eyes adjust. Lorenzo dips the heated end of the blowpipe into the crucible of molten glass. He turns the pipe slowly as he gathers the glass so that the material wraps around the end in an even layer. He withdraws the pipe and he holds it with the gather pointing downward, and he allows the glass to cool for a few seconds until it stops moving and sagging. The gather is a glowing orange mass about the size of a small apple, and it has the consistency of thick honey. Lorenzo carries the pipe to the bench and he begins the first step of the cylinder process, which is to shape the gather into a uniform cylinder that will become the body of the future flat pane. He rolls the gather on a smooth iron plate called the marva. The marva is a flat slab of iron that is kept cool by a thin film of water that the boy applies with a damp cloth between uses. Lorenzo rolls the glass back and forth with a steady rhythm, and the glass takes on a more regular shape, like a slightly flattened ball. He blows a small puff of air into the pipe and the glass expands slightly into a small bubble. He rolls it again and he blows another puff, and the bubble grows larger. The process is repeated many times with small adjustments of angle and pressure. Each puff of air must be exactly the right amount, because too much air will make the walls too thin, and too little air will make the glass too heavy and difficult to work. The bubble grows gradually, and Lorenzo shapes it with a wooden paddle that he dips in water before touching the hot glass. The paddle is made of cherry wood, and it has been charred black on one side from repeated contact with the molten material. Lorenzo uses the paddle to flatten the bottom of the bubble and to guide the shape into a more cylindrical form. He holds the pipe at an angle and he swings it gently in a pendulum motion that uses the weight of the glass to stretch it downward. The cylinder lengthens and narrows, and the walls become thinner and more even. You watch from your stool and you observe the small details of the process. The way Lorenzo's hands move in a constant slow rotation to keep the glass centered on the pipe. The way his eyes are fixed on the point where the glass meets the air, and he is watching the color of the glow which tells him the temperature of the material. The way the boy at the bellows adjusts the airflow in response to small signals from Lorenzo that are so subtle you cannot identify them. The boy simply knows when to push harder and when to ease off, because he has been doing this work for several years, and the rhythm is inside his body. The cylinder is now about 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter, and its walls are the thickness of a pane of window glass. Lorenzo holds the pipe horizontally, and he examines the cylinder from end to end. He's looking for any thin spots that might cause the glass to collapse when it is opened flat. He finds a small area near the closed end that is slightly thinner than the rest, and he reheats that section in the glory hole, and he rolls it again on the marva to even out the thickness. The glass glows orange and then softens to a deeper red as it cools slightly. When the cylinder is uniform, Lorenzo carries it to the glory hole for the final heating before the opening. He holds the pipe with both hands, and he rotates it slowly in the intense heat of the small round opening. The glass becomes softer and more pliable, and the glow brightens to a pale yellow. Lorenzo withdraws the pipe, and he moves quickly to the bench where the boy has placed a large flat iron plate that has been dusted with a fine powder of crushed clay to prevent the glass from sticking. The iron plate is about 3 feet square, and it is supported on low brick pillars so that it sits level and stable. Lorenzo holds the pipe with the cylinder suspended above the iron plate. He takes a small iron tool with a pointed end and he touches it to the glass near the end of the cylinder that is attached to the pipe. He scores a line around the circumference with a quick, steady motion. Then he takes the second tool with a flat blade and he taps the glass gently just beyond the score line. The end of the cylinder separates from the pipe with a clean crack that sounds like a small twig snapping. The closed end of the cylinder is now open to the air, and Lorenzo sets the pipe aside and picks up a long iron rod that has a small hook at the end. He uses the hook to catch the edge of the cylinder at the opposite end, which is still closed. He lifts the cylinder slightly, and he uses a pair of iron shears to cut off the closed end. The glass is still hot enough that the shears pass through it like a knife through soft cheese, and the cut end falls away onto a pile of scrap glass that will be remelted tomorrow. The cylinder is now open at both ends, and it is a true cylinder of uniform thickness and diameter. The next step is the most delicate part of the entire process. Lorenzo takes a tool that is like a long iron blade with a thin, sharp edge, He inserts the blade into one end of the cylinder, and he draws it down the length of the glass from one opening to the other. The hot glass parts along the cut line with a soft hissing sound, and Lorenzo guides the cut with his other hand, which is wrapped in a thick leather glove. The cylinder is now split along its length, and it is no longer a tube, but a curved sheet that wants to flatten itself. Lorenzo lowers the split cylinder onto the iron plate. He uses the wooden paddle and the iron blade to gently coax the glass to open flat. The glass is still hot enough to be flexible, and it moves slowly like a thick piece of cloth being unfolded. The edges that were the cut line separate, and the curved surface flattens against the iron plate. Lorenzo works from the center outward, pressing the glass down, with smooth, steady strokes of the paddle. The glass makes a faint sound as it flattens, a sound that is something between a sigh and the rustle of heavy silk. When the glass is fully flat, Lorenzo steps back and he examines the sheet. The surface is not perfectly smooth because the cylinder method always leaves slight variations in thickness and faint lines where the glass was rolled on the marva. But for a window pane, the slight irregularities are acceptable and even desirable because they give the glass a character that perfectly flat, modern glass does not possess. The light that passes through this glass will be slightly distorted, and the view of the garden outside the nobleman's villa will have a soft, dreamlike quality that is the signature of true Venetian flat glass. The sheet of glass is now cooling on the iron plate. It will remain there for several minutes until it is firm enough to be moved without bending. Lorenzo uses this time to prepare the scoring tool that will cut the large sheet into the 3 diamond-shaped panes that the nobleman requires. The scoring tool is a small iron wheel with a sharp edge that is mounted on a wooden handle. Lorenzo takes a wooden template from a shelf on the wall. The template is a flat piece of thin wood that has been cut into the exact diamond shape with sides of 6 inches. The template is old and its edges are darkened from contact with hot glass over many years. When the sheet is cooled enough that it no longer glows but is still warm to the touch, Lorenzo places the wooden template on the surface. He holds it steady with one hand, and with the other he draws the scoring wheel along the edge of the template, pressing down with a firm, even pressure. The wheel makes a fine line on the surface of the glass, a line that is almost invisible except for the way it catches the light. Lorenzo repeats this process 3 times, positioning the template to cut 3 diamonds from the sheet. The remaining glass around the diamonds will be scrap, and it will go into the pile to be remelted. After the score lines are made, Lorenzo takes a pair of flat-nosed pliers and he positions them at the edge of the sheet aligned with one of the score lines. He applies pressure slowly and evenly, and the glass breaks along the line with a clean, sharp snap. The break follows the score precisely because glass always wants to break along the path of least resistance, and the score line provides that path. Lorenzo lifts away the first diamond pane and he holds it up to the light from the furnace. The glass is clear with the faint greenish tint that is characteristic of the Venetian mixture, and the surface has the soft ripples of the cylinder method. It is a good pane and it will fit the nobleman's window. Lorenzo breaks out the second diamond and then the third. He places the 3 panes on a wooden rack that is lined with a piece of soft wool cloth to protect the edges. The panes will cool completely on this rack, and then they will be wrapped in paper and placed in a small wooden crate for transport to the villa. The boy will take the scrap glass from the iron plate and he will place it in the pile near the furnace door, where it will be added to the next batch of raw materials and melted again into new glass. Nothing is wasted in a glass furnace because glass is simply sand and ash that has been transformed by fire, and it can be transformed again and again without losing its essential nature. You watch from your stool as Lorenzo cleans his tools and hangs them back on the wall. He wipes the marva with a damp cloth, and he checks the crucible to see how much glass remains for the rest of the day's work. The boy at the bellows has reduced the airflow again, and the fire has returned to its steady orange glow. The room is quiet now after the activity of the flat glass making, and the only sounds are the hum of the fire and the distant lap of the water, and the soft footsteps of the boy as he moves between the lair and the scrap pile. You take a small piece of paper from the pocket of your gown, and you make a note with the stub of charcoal. The note says simply, "Tre lastre piattamente per villa Asolo," which means 3 flat diamond panes for the Asolo villa. You will transfer this information to the ledger later when you return to the office. You will record the date and the description and the cost of the materials and the labor. The nobleman will be charged the standard price for flat glass, which is calculated by the square foot, and there will be a small additional charge for the urgency of the order. The total will be something like 2 ducats and 12 soldi, and this amount will be added to the income column of the ledger, and the books will balance as they always do. You remain on the stool for a while longer, and you watch the furnace room settle back into its ordinary rhythm. Lorenzo has begun a new piece, a simple drinking glass with no decoration, and he is working with the same slow, steady motions that he has used for decades. The boy is at his post near the lair, waiting for the next piece to emerge. The other boy is at the bellows, maintaining the steady flow of air. The fire burns and the glass melts, and the day moves forward. You think about the 3 diamond panes that now sit on the wooden rack, cooling to the temperature of the room. In a few days they will travel by barge across the lagoon, and then by cart up the dusty road to the hills near Asolo. A glazier will fit them into the laid framework of the nobleman's window, and they will replace the panes that were shattered by the falling cypress branch. The nobleman will stand in his salon, and he will look through the new glass at the garden outside, and he will see the cypress trees and the gravel path and the fountain with its small stone basin. The view will be slightly softened by the gentle ripples in the glass, and the colors of the garden will be muted and blended in a way that is pleasing to the eye. The nobleman will not think about the furnace on Murano, or the widow who keeps the ledgers, or the master Lorenzo who shaped the cylinder and flattened it on the iron plate. He will simply see his garden through the new glass, and he will be satisfied. You rise from the stool and you walk back through the door into the office. The air in the office is cool and still after the warmth of the furnace room, and you feel the change in your skin as a slight tightening. You sit at the desk and you open the main ledger to the current page. You take up the quill and you dip it in the ink and you write the entry for the flat glass panes. Tre mastre piat a diamante per finestra. Villa Asolo you write in the description column. Then in the appropriate columns you write the date and the amount to be charged. The ink dries and you close the ledger and you place the quill back in its pot of sand. The order is recorded and the glass is made and the day continues. You sit at the desk and you look out of the small window at the grey lagoon and you listen to the sounds of the furnace and the water. The morning has passed and the afternoon is beginning, and nothing of great importance has occurred. 3 panes of flat glass have been added to the world's supply of flat glass, and a window in a villa in the hills will soon be whole again. The nobleman will see his garden and the cypress tree will continue to grow, and the glass will sit in its lead frame for many years, catching the light and softening the view, and no one will think of the hands that made it except perhaps you sitting here in the quiet office with the closed ledger and the fading light of an autumn afternoon on Murano. The main ledger lies open on the desk before you and the page is nearly full. You have been working through the entries for the past week and the task is almost complete. There is only the final column of numbers to be added and then the balance carried forward to the next page. But you do not pick up the quill and you do not dip it in the ink. You sit with your hands resting on the open book and you look out of the small window at the grey lagoon and you wait. The reason you wait is the tide. The weekly reconciliation of the accounts is a task that requires a particular state of mind, and this state of mind is easier to achieve when the tide is at a certain point in its cycle. You have learned over the years that the numbers seem to align themselves more readily when the water outside is still or nearly still, and the light is soft, and the sounds of the island are muted. The tide is now approaching its high point, and the water in the canal has risen to within a few inches of the top of the stone embankment. The current has slowed to a barely perceptible drift, and the surface of the lagoon is smooth and grey like a sheet of unpolished metal. You watch the water through the small round panes of the window, and you see the way the light moves across its surface. There is no wind this morning, and so the water is not broken by waves. Instead, there are only the long, slow undulations that come from the deeper currents moving far below the surface. These undulations create faint lines on the water that are lighter or darker than the surrounding grey, and they shift and merge and separate again in a pattern that never repeats. The water is never truly still because the lagoon is connected to the sea, and the sea is always moving somewhere, even when the surface appears calm. The tide on Murano and throughout the Venetian lagoon is a complex thing that is governed by the pull of the moon and the shape of the Adriatic basin and the direction of the wind and a dozen other factors that are known only to the old fishermen who have spent their entire lives on the water. The tide rises and falls twice each day, but the height of the high water and the depth of the low water vary according to the phase of the moon and the season of the year. In the autumn, the tides are generally higher than in the summer because the prevailing winds push more water into the northern end of the Adriatic, and this water has nowhere to go except into the lagoon. The high tide this morning will be one of the higher ones of the month, and it will cover the lower steps of the canal embankments, and it will float the small boats that are tied to the mooring posts, so that their gunwales rise almost level with the fondamenta. You wait and you watch the water rise. The movement is so slow that you cannot see it happening in the moment. You can only know that it is happening by looking at a fixed point, and then looking away, and then looking back again. The barnacles on the canal steps that were exposed to the air an hour ago are now covered by a thin film of water, and the film will grow deeper until the steps disappear entirely. The green algae that grows in the zone between high and low tide is now submerged, and its fronds wave gently in the current, like the hair of a person floating in a bath. The water climbs the stones one imperceptible increment at a time, and it will continue to climb until the moon reaches its highest point in the sky, and then it will pause and begin the long, slow retreat back toward the sea. You turn your gaze from the window, and you look again at the open ledger. The numbers are waiting for you in their neat columns, and they will not add themselves. But you do not yet reach for the quill. There is a rhythm to the week, and the reconciliation of the accounts is best done when the tide is fully high and the water is at its peak of stillness. The moment of high tide is a kind of pause in the day, a brief interval when the lagoon seems to hold its breath before exhaling back toward the sea. In that pause, the numbers will come together, and the small discrepancies will reveal themselves, and the balance will be found. While you wait, you think about the water and its constant patient movement. The water of the lagoon has been rising and falling against these stones for longer than the furnaces existed, and longer than the island has been inhabited. The first people who came to these marshy islands found the same grey water and the same slow tides, and they learned to build their houses on wooden piles driven deep into the mud, so that the water could rise and fall beneath them without harm. The water is both a friend and an enemy to the people of the lagoon. It carries their boats and brings their trade, and it also eats away at the foundations of their buildings and threatens to rise too high during the storms of winter. The relationship is one of constant negotiation, and the people of Murano have learned to watch the water and to understand its moods, and to wait for the right moment before they act. The high tide is also the time when the water of the Sacca della Misericordia is at its deepest and most still. The Sacca is a small inlet on the eastern side of the island, and it is the place where the glass furnaces of Murano have been dumping their waste for as long as anyone can remember. The word sacca means a sack or a bag, and the inlet is shaped like a wide, shallow pocket that opens onto the main lagoon. The currents in the sacca are weak, and the water circulates slowly, so that anything that is dropped into it tends to stay there rather than being carried away. Over the centuries, the bottom of the sacca has become covered with a deep layer of broken glass. You have walked to the edge of the sacca many times, and you have looked down into the shallow water near the shore. The glass that is dumped there consists of all the pieces that are not good enough to sell, the goblets with bubbles in the wrong places, and the beads that are misshapen, and the sheets of flat glass that cracked during the flattening process, and the scraps from the cutting of diamond panes. The furnace workers carry this waste glass in heavy buckets, and they tip it over the edge of the embankment, and it falls into the water with a clattering sound that is muffled by the depth. The glass sinks and settles on the bottom, and it lies there in the dim greenish light that filters down from the surface. Over time, the movement of the water pushes the broken glass back and forth across the bottom of the sacca. The sharp edges of the freshly broken pieces are gradually worn smooth by the constant friction of glass against glass and glass against sand. The process takes many years, and it is invisible to the human eye because it happens so slowly. But if you walk along the shore of the Secca at low tide, you can find pieces of glass that have been washed up onto the narrow strip of mud and gravel. These pieces are no longer sharp and dangerous. They are smooth and rounded, and they have a soft frosted surface that feels like silk when you rub it with your thumb. The colors of the smoothed glass are the colors of the Murano furnaces. There are deep reds that come from the copper ruby glass, and there are bright blues that come from the cobalt, and there are greens of every shade from the palest sage to the darkest emerald. There are pieces of opaque white glass that was meant for beads, and pieces of clear glass that has taken on a faint milky translucence from the abrasion of the sand. And there are pieces of the special multicolored glass that was made by fusing different colors together and then stretching and twisting the mass into complex patterns. These pieces are the most beautiful of all because the smoothing of the water has revealed the inner structure of the glass, and you can see the layers and the swirls and the tiny bubbles that were trapped during the making. When you hold one of these smoothed pieces in your hand and you turn it to catch the light, it glows with a soft inner radiance that is different from the brilliance of new glass. The light passes through the frosted surface and it is diffused and softened so that the color seems to come from deep within the material. The piece is no longer a shard of waste glass. It has been transformed by the patient work of the water into something that resembles a dull jewel or a piece of colored ice that will never melt. The children of Murano sometimes collect these pieces and they keep them in small boxes or they string them on threads and wear them as simple necklaces. The adults pay them no attention because the Saka is full of such things and they are as common as the pebbles on the shore. The Saka is a quiet place and few people go there except to dump the waste glass. The inlet is surrounded by a low wall of brick and stone and there is a narrow path that leads to it from the main fundamenta. At high tide the water covers most of the shore and only the top of the wall is visible. At low tide a strip of dark mud is exposed and this is where the smooth glass can be found. The mud is black and it has a strong smell that is a mixture of salt and decay and the faint sharp tang of the chemicals that leach from the glass. It is not an unpleasant smell, but it is distinctive and you would recognize it anywhere. You think about the Saka as you wait for the tide to reach its peak. The water outside your window is now very high and the current has stopped moving entirely. The surface of the lagoon is a flat mirror of grey that reflects the grey sky so perfectly that the horizon disappears and you cannot tell where the water ends and the air begins. This is the moment of slack water, the brief interval between the incoming tide and the outgoing tide, when the forces of the moon and the sea are perfectly balanced and the water rests. You pick up the quill and you dip it in the ink and you begin to add the column of numbers. The numbers are small and they represent the small transactions of the week. The cost of the beechwood and the price of the clay and the payment for the manganese and the income from the sale of the beads and the charge for the flat glass panes. You add them slowly and you write the totals at the bottom of the column. The numbers align and the balance is found. There is a small discrepancy of 3 soldi and you trace it back through the entries until you find the error in the tally for the charcoal used for the lamp working torches. You correct the number and the balance is now perfect. The ink dries and you close the ledger. The tide has begun to turn. You can see the first faint movement of the water as it begins to flow back toward the sea. The current is still very slow and it will take some time before it becomes visible as a definite direction. But the pause is over and the lagoon is exhaling and the water will now fall for the next 6 hours until it reaches the low point and then it will begin to rise again. You rise from the stool and you walk to the door that leads to the fondamenta. You open the door and you step outside. The air is cool and damp and it carries the smell of the lagoon at high tide, which is a fresher smell than the smell at low tide because the water has covered the mudflats and the decaying vegetation. You turn to your left and you walk along the fondamenta in the direction of the eastern side of the island where the Sacca della Misericordia lies. The walk takes you past the familiar sights of the Rio dei Vrei, the wall with the pale green lichen, and the section of newer grey stones, and the window where the warmth from the furnace reaches the path. You pass the storehouse with its heavy door and its intact seal of red wax. You pass the houses of the bead-making women, and you hear the faint sounds of their work through the closed shutters. You pass a small bridge that arches over a narrow side canal, and you see a man pushing a cart loaded with barrels of sand. He nods to you as he passes, and you nod back, and neither of you speaks. The Sacca della Misericordia is at the end of a short path that branches off from the main fondamenta. The path is made of packed earth and crushed brick, and it is bordered on one side by a low wall and on the other by a row of small houses that face away from the water. The path leads to a wider area where the embankment forms a rough semicircle around the inlet. There is a stone bench here that was placed many years ago by someone who wanted to sit and look at the water. The bench is simple and it is made of 2 upright stones with a flat slab laid across them. The surface of the slab is worn smooth by the passage of many bodies and it has a slight dip in the center. You sit down on the bench and you look out across the Sacca. The tide is still high and the water covers most of the shore. The surface is smooth and grey, like the lagoon outside your window. On the far side of the inlet, you can see the low buildings of another furnace and a small boat tied to a mooring post. The boat is empty and it rocks very gently with the subtle movement of the water. Above the buildings you can see the bell tower of the church of San Pietro Martir, which is the other main church on the island of Murano. You sit and you watch the water and you wait. You are not waiting for anything in particular. You are simply sitting on the stone bench in the quiet of the Sacca, and you are letting the slow movement of the tide carry your thoughts away. The water is beginning to fall now, and the current is becoming visible as a faint drift toward the opening of the inlet where it joins the main lagoon. Small pieces of floating debris are carried along with the current, a twig and a feather, and a piece of straw that has fallen from a barge. They move slowly, and they trace the path of the water as it finds its way back to the sea. While you sit, you see a boat appear at the mouth of the Sacca. It is a small official-looking craft with a low cabin in the center and a single man standing at the stern with an oar. The boat is painted a dark color, and it flies a small white flag from a short staff at the bow. This is the courier boat from the health office of the Doge, and it makes a circuit of the islands each day to deliver news of the plague in the main city. The boat does not stop, and it does not approach the shore. It simply passes by the mouth of the Sacca and continues on its way along the outer edge of the island. The white flag is the signal that there is no new official news of the sickness. If the flag were red, it would mean that the plague had worsened and that new restrictions were being imposed. If the flag were black, it would mean that the plague had reached the island itself, and that the furnaces would be closed and the people confined to their homes. But the flag is white, and so the news is the same as it was yesterday and the day before. The plague continues in Venice and it takes its daily toll, but it has not crossed the water to Murano. The glass is still being made, and the ledgers are still being kept, and the tides are still rising and falling. You watch the courier boat until it disappears behind a cluster of buildings on the far side of the Sacca. The white flag is the last thing you see, a small pale shape against the grey sky, and then it is gone. The water continues its slow retreat, and the surface of the Sacca is once again empty, except for the drifting debris and the faint ripples of the current. You sit for a while longer, and you think about the glass that lies beneath the surface of the water. The broken pieces and the discarded scraps and the failed experiments of generations of glassmakers. They are down there in the dim green light, being pushed and pulled by the tides and slowly smoothed by the friction of their own kind. The water is patient, and it has all the time it needs. A piece of glass that was dropped into the Sacca 100 years ago is still being smoothed today, and it will be smoothed for another 100 years until it is reduced to a tiny polished pebble that is indistinguishable from the sand. The tide has fallen enough now, but a narrow strip of dark mud is beginning to appear along the edge of the embankment. You can see the first pieces of glass glinting in the mud, where the water has just retreated. They catch the grey light, and they flash with small points of colour that are muted and soft. You do not go down to the mud to collect them, because you are not a child, and you have no need of smooth glass pebbles. You simply observe them from your seat on the stone bench, and you appreciate their quiet beauty and their patient transformation. The afternoon is advancing, and the light is beginning to change from the flat grey of midday to a slightly warmer grey that hints at the approach of evening. The air is growing cooler, and you feel it through the wool of your shawl. You rise from the bench, and you walk back along the path to the main fondamenta. The walk back to the furnace office is the same as the walk to the Sacca, but in reverse. You pass the small bridge and the houses of the beadmakers and the storehouse and the wall with the lichen. The sounds of the island are the familiar sounds of the afternoon, the distant hum of furnaces and the occasional splash of an oar, and the soft voices of people going about their business. You reach the office door, and you open it, and you step inside. The room is cool and still, and the ledger is closed on the desk where you left it. You sit down on the stool, and you place your hands on the cover of the book. The weekly reconciliation is complete, and the numbers are balanced, and the courier boat has passed with its white flag. The tide has turned, and it is now falling toward the low point, where it will pause again before beginning the next rise. You sit in the quiet office, and you listen to the sound of the furnace humming through the wall and the sound of the water moving in the canal outside. The day has been a day of waiting and watching, and of small, quiet actions. You have added a column of numbers, and you have walked to the Sakar, and you have seen the white flag, and you have returned. Nothing has changed, and nothing has been resolved. The plague continues in Venice, and the glass continues to be made on Murano, and the water continues to rise and fall against the stones. The world is the same as it was this morning, and it will be the same tomorrow. You do not open the ledger again because the work for the week is done. You simply sit, and you rest your hands on the worn leather cover, and you let the sounds of the island fill the space around you. The light through the small window fades slowly toward evening, and the room grows dimmer. The furnace hums its low, steady note, and the water laps at the canal steps. You wait for nothing in particular because there is nothing that needs your attention at this moment. The tide is falling, and the Sakar is revealing its treasures of smooth glass to the empty air, and the courier boat is somewhere on the far side of the island continuing its slow circuit. You sit, and you breathe, and you let the day come to its quiet close. The evening has come to the island of Murano, and the light through the small office window has faded from grey to a deep blue that is almost black. You have lit the single tallow candle, and it sits on the desk in its iron holder, casting a small circle of warm, unsteady light across the surface of the wood. The flame flickers occasionally when a draught finds its way through the gaps around the door, but for the most part it burns steadily with a soft hissing sound that is barely audible beneath the hum of the furnace next door. The office is warm enough because the bricks of the shared wall radiate the stored heat of the day's fires, and the wool shawl around your shoulders provides an additional layer of comfort against the autumn chill. The ledgers are closed and stacked on their shelf, and the quill has been cleaned and placed in its pot of sand. The ink dish has been covered with its small slate lid to keep the dust from settling on the remaining ink. The desk is clear except for the candle and a single sheet of paper that you have taken from the drawer where you keep the good writing paper. This paper is different from the paper of the ledgers, which is thick and durable and made to last for many years. The good paper is thinner and smoother, and it has a fine, even texture that barely catches the nib of a quill. It was made in the city of Fabriano, on the other side of the Italian peninsula, where the paper makers have perfected the art of creating sheets that are both strong and delicate. You hold the sheet of paper up to the candle flame, and you look at it carefully. The light passes through the paper and reveals its inner structure. You can see the faint parallel lines called laid lines that are created by the wires of the papermaker's mold. Running perpendicular to these lines are the chain lines which are slightly wider apart and which mark where the supporting wires were attached. Together these lines form a subtle grid that is only visible when the paper is held up to a strong light. In the center of the sheet there is a watermark that shows the image of a running bull with its head lowered and its tail raised. The watermark is a sign of the paper's origin and its quality, and it has been pressed into the wet fibers during the making so that it becomes a permanent part of the sheet. You lower the paper and you place it flat on the desk in front of you. The surface is a pale creamy color that is almost white but not quite, and it has a slight translucence at the edges where the paper is thinnest. You reach out and you touch the surface with the tip of your finger, and you feel the smoothness of the paper and the very faint texture of the fibers that lie just beneath. The paper makes a soft rustling sound when you move it, and this sound is one of the most familiar sounds in your life because you have handled paper nearly every day for as long as you can remember. Beside the sheet of good paper sits the inkwell and the quill. The ink in the well has formed a thin skin on its surface because it has been sitting undisturbed for several hours. You can see the skin as a faintly darker patch in the center of the black liquid, and it reflects the candlelight with a dull sheen. The quill rests in its pot of sand, and the nib is clean and dry. You do not reach for the quill, and you do not break the skin on the ink. You simply sit and you look at the paper, and you wait. The letter you might write is a letter to your son, who is a journeyman glassmaker in the city of Antwerp in the region of Flanders far to the north. He has been there for nearly 2 years learning the techniques of the northern glass houses, which are different from the techniques of Murano. The northern glass is made with different materials, and it has a different character, and your son went there to broaden his knowledge and to become a more complete master of the craft. He writes to you when he can, and his letters arrive sporadically carried by merchants and travelers who make the long journey across the Alps and down through the Italian states to Venice. His last letter arrived in the early summer before the plague began to spread in earnest, and it spoke of his work and his health and the small details of his life in a foreign city. You have read that letter many times, and you keep it folded in a small wooden box in the sleeping room. You would like to write to him tonight. You would like to tell him that the furnace is still operating and that the master Lorenzo continues to make good glass and that the orders from the German trading house are being fulfilled. You would like to tell him that the bead makers are still working in their homes and that the flat glass panes for the nobleman's villa were completed without difficulty. You would like to tell him that you are well and that the plague has not reached Murano and that he should not worry about you. You would like to ask him about his work and his health, and whether he has enough money, and whether the food in Antwerp agrees with him. You would like to tell him that you think of him often and that you look forward to the day when he will return to the island and take his place in the furnace as a master in his own right. But you do not write any of these things. The quill remains in its pot of sand, and the ink remains in its well with the thin skin unbroken, and the paper remains blank on the desk before you. The reason you do not write is that the postal routes are closed. The plague that moves through Venice has spread to many of the cities along the trade routes, and the authorities in each town and each principality have closed their gates to travelers. Merchants are not moving, and couriers are not riding, and the ships that usually carry letters across the sea are staying in port or sailing only to the nearest safe harbors. A letter written tonight would sit in the office or in some merchant's warehouse for weeks or months before it could begin its journey. By the time it reached Antwerp, your son might have moved to another city, or the situation might have changed in ways that would make the letter's contents irrelevant, or the letter might simply be lost along the way, as so many letters are lost in times of disruption. You know all of this, and so you do not write. The act of not writing is a quiet act that requires a certain kind of patience. You sit at the desk and you look at the blank paper and you allow the unwritten words to remain in your mind where they are safe and where they cannot be lost or delayed or misinterpreted. The letter exists in a kind of potential state, like the glass that has not yet been gathered from the crucible. It could become something real, but for now it is only a possibility that you hold gently in your thoughts. The candle flame flickers again, and you watch the way the light moves across the surface of the paper. The paper is not perfectly flat because it has absorbed a small amount of moisture from the air, and this has caused the edges to lift very slightly from the desk. The lifted edges cast tiny shadows that are sharp near the paper and soft further away. The shadows move with the flickering of the flame, and they create a subtle animation on the wooden surface of the desk, a kind of silent dance that is performed by the paper and the light and the air. You look away from the paper and you look at the inkwell. The ink inside is a deep black that absorbs the light rather than reflecting it. The skin on the surface is now more pronounced, and it has developed a few small wrinkles where it has begun to dry and contract. If you were to dip the quill into the ink, the skin would break and it would cling to the nib, and you would have to wipe it away on the edge of the well. This is a small thing, but it is one of the many small things that stand between you and the act of writing. The skin on the ink is a barrier that you do not cross, and it will remain intact until the morning when you will stir the ink with the tip of the quill and begin the day's entries in the ledger. The window of the office is dark now, and you cannot see the lagoon beyond the small round panes. The glass reflects the candle flame back at you as a tiny orange dot that wavers in the black surface. Outside the window, the night has settled over the island, and the sounds of the day have been replaced by the sounds of the night. The furnace next door is banked for the evening, and its roar has subsided to a low, steady hum that is more felt than heard. The water in the canal has reached its low point, and it will soon begin to rise again with the incoming tide. The only sounds that break the silence are the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the canal and the distant single bark of a dog somewhere on the far side of the island. A fish splashes in the canal just outside the window. The sound is a sharp, wet clap that is followed by a series of smaller splashes as the fish returns to the water and swims away. The sound is unexpected and it draws your attention for a moment, and then it fades and the silence returns. You think about the fish moving through the dark water of the canal, navigating by senses that you cannot imagine. The fish does not know about the plague or the closed postal routes or the blank sheet of paper on the desk. The fish knows only the water and the mud and the small creatures it eats and the larger creatures it must avoid. The fish lives its entire life within a few hundred yards of this spot, and it is content with that small world. You turn your attention back to the desk, and you notice a fine layer of dust that has settled on the brass scale since you last used it. The dust is very thin, and it is only visible when the candlelight strikes it at a low angle. It consists of tiny particles of ash from the furnace and fine sand from the glass mixture and fibers from your wool gown and the wool shawl and countless other small things that float in the air of the office. The dust settles on every surface, and it must be wiped away periodically or it will accumulate into a visible layer. You have not wiped the brass scale in several days, and the dust has begun to gather in the crevices where the chains attach to the beam and in the shallow depression of the pans. You look at the dust and you think about the fact that it is always falling. Every moment of every day small particles are drifting down through the air and coming to rest on the surfaces of the world. The dust is a record of time passing and of the small, slow changes that are constantly occurring even when nothing seems to be happening. The dust on the brass scale was not there a week ago, and it will be thicker a week from now if you do not wipe it away. The accumulation is so gradual that you cannot see it happening, but it is happening nonetheless, like the tide rising and falling and the lichen growing on the brick wall and the glass smoothing in the sakka. The inkstand on the desk is also gathering dust. The inkstand is a simple wooden block with holes drilled into it to hold the inkwell and the pot of sand and the small groove for the quill to rest. The wood is dark with age and it has a few old ink stains that have soaked into the grain and become permanent. The dust on the inkstand is more visible than the dust on the brass scale because the wood is darker and the dust is pale. You can see a fine line of dust along the edge of the inkwell where it meets the wood and a small accumulation in the groove where the quill rests. The dust does not harm anything and it does not interfere with the function of the inkstand. It is simply there, a quiet reminder of the hours that have passed since you last cleaned this corner of the desk. You do not wipe away the dust. You leave it where it is, and you continue to sit and to look at the blank paper and the unbroken skin on the ink and the flickering candle flame. The evening is long, and there is no need to do anything at all. The letter to your son will not be written tonight, and it may not be written for many nights to come. The words that you would like to send across the mountains and the rivers to the city of Antwerp will remain in your mind where they are kept warm and safe. Your son will not read them, but he does not need to read them because he knows that you think of him and that you are well and that the furnace continues to operate. These things are true whether they are written on paper or not, and they do not require a letter to make them real. You think about the things that are not happening in the office tonight. The quill is not moving across the paper and the ink is not flowing from the nib. The words are not forming on the page and the letter is not being folded and sealed with wax. The courier is not riding along a dark road through a mountain pass and the ship is not sailing across a stormy sea. The merchant in Antwerp is not receiving a bundle of letters and sorting through them to find the one addressed to your son. Your son is not breaking the seal and unfolding the paper and reading your words by the light of his own candle in his own room in a foreign city. None of these things are happening and they will not happen tonight. The things that are happening are much smaller and quieter. The candle is burning down and the pool of liquid tallow around the wick is growing deeper. The flame is consuming the fuel at a steady rate and the wick is slowly charring and bending. The dust is settling on the inkstand and the brass scale and the surface of the desk. The furnace is humming its low note through the wall and the water is beginning to rise in the canal. The fish has moved on to another part of the canal and it may splash again or it may not. The night is passing and the morning will come eventually. You reach out and you take the sheet of good paper and you hold it up to the candle flame once more. The light shines through it and reveals the laid lines and the chain lines and the watermark of the running bull. The paper is still blank and it will remain blank. You lower the paper and you place it carefully back in the drawer where it belongs. You close the drawer and the paper disappears into the darkness inside. It will wait there until the postal routes open again or until you need a sheet of good paper for some other purpose. Paper is patient and it does not mind waiting. You sit for a while longer and you watch the candle burn. The flame has grown slightly smaller as the wick has charred and you know that you should trim it soon, or the flame will begin to smoke and the room will fill with the smell of burning tallow. But you do not trim it yet because you are not ready to end the evening. You simply sit and you listen to the sounds of the night and you let the unwritten letter rest in your mind where it is safe. The fish splashes again somewhere further down the canal and the sound is softer this time, like a stone dropped into deep water. The dog barks once more and then is silent. The furnace hums and the water laps and the dust settles. The candle flame flickers and steadies and flickers again. You sit in the quiet office with your hands resting on the desk and you wait for nothing in particular. And the night continues its slow passage toward the morning. After a time, you reach for the iron snuffers and you open the small box and you position it over the candle flame. You close the snuffers gently and the flame is extinguished, with a small hiss and a curl of smoke that rises and then fades into the darkness. The room is now completely dark and the only light comes from the faint glow of the banked furnace that seeps through the cracks around the door. You sit for a moment longer in the darkness, and then you rise from the stool and you walk through the door into the house where you will sleep. The letter remains unwritten, and the paper remains blank in the drawer, and the dust continues to settle on the inkstand. The night is quiet and the island is still, and the lagoon rises and falls against the stones. Your son is somewhere in the city of Antwerp, and he may be sleeping or he may be awake and thinking of you as you think of him. The distance between you is great, but it is only distance, and distance can be crossed when the time is right. For now the time is not right, and so you wait and you do not write, and the paper stays blank, and the ink stays in the well with its unbroken skin, and the candle stays dark, and the night goes on. The morning has arrived on the island of Murano, and the light through the small office window is a pale grey that is almost white where it touches the surface of the desk. You have been sitting on the wooden stool for perhaps half an hour, and you have not yet opened any of the ledgers. The office is quiet and the furnace next door is still warming to its full working temperature, so that the sound through the wall is a gentle murmur rather than the deep roar that will come later. The water in the canal is at mid-tide, and it moves with a slow, patient current that makes a soft lapping sound against the stone steps outside. On the desk before you sits the main ledger. It is the same large volume bound in dark brown leather that you have handled every working day since the spring when your husband was no longer there to handle it himself. The cover is closed and the leather is cool beneath your palms. You have placed the book in the exact center of the desk, so that it aligns with the edge of the wood and with the position of the stool. The alignment is not necessary for any practical reason, but it is a small ritual that you perform at the beginning of the monthly reconciliation, and it helps to settle your mind into the proper state for the work ahead. Today is the last day of the month, and it is the day when the books must be balanced and the totals carried forward to the fresh pages of the new month. You have been working toward this day for the past 4 weeks, and you have made all the small daily entries, and you have checked the supplies of wood and clay, and you have recorded the orders for beads and flat glass. All of these separate threads must now be gathered together and woven into a single neat column of numbers that will show the true state of the furnace's finances. The German merchants will expect to see this column when they next visit, and they will expect it to be accurate to the last soldo. You place both hands on the cover of the ledger, and you feel the familiar roughness of the leather and the slight give of the boards beneath. The cover has a small warp in it from years of being opened and closed, and the warp causes the book to sit slightly unevenly on the desk. You have learned to compensate for this by placing a small folded piece of paper under one corner, and you do this now without thinking about it. The paper is a scrap from an old order that was never filled, and it has been serving this purpose for many months. The ink on the scrap has faded to a pale brown, and the words are no longer legible, but the paper is still thick enough to level the book. You open the ledger, and the spine makes its familiar creaking sound as the pages separate. You turn past the entries for the current month, and you go all the way back to the very first page of the book. This page was written by your husband's father many years ago when the furnace first came into the family. The ink on this page is a soft rusty brown, and the letters are formed in an old-fashioned hand with long flourishes on the capital letters and a slight backward slant to the lowercase. The first entry records the purchase of the bricks that were used to build the main furnace chamber, and the cost is given in ducats and soldi, and the date is written in full with the year given as 1547, which was nearly 30 years ago. You look at this first page for a long moment and you think about the hands that wrote these numbers. Your husband's father was a man you knew only briefly before he died, and you remember him as a quiet presence who spent most of his time in the furnace room watching the glass being made. He was not a glassmaker himself, because the family had always been the keepers of the accounts rather than the workers of the fire. He understood the business of glass without understanding the craft of it, and he passed this understanding to your husband, who passed it to you. The book on the desk is the physical record of this passing, and it contains the entire history of the furnace in its columns of neat, faded numbers. You turn the pages slowly, and you watch the handwriting change as the years progress. The early pages are all in the hand of your husband's father, with its old-fashioned flourishes. Then there is a period where the handwriting changes to a younger, more cramped style that you recognize as your husband's hand when he was first learning to keep the books. The letters are smaller and tighter, and there are more corrections where he wrote the wrong number and had to cross it out. As the pages advance, the hand becomes more confident, and the corrections become fewer, and the columns become neater. Then you reach the pages that you wrote yourself, beginning in the spring of this year. Your hand is different from your husband's hand, and different from his father's hand. Your letters are more upright, and your numbers are formed with slightly more space between them. The three hands are distinct, but they share a common purpose, and together they form a continuous record that stretches back across 3 decades. You turn forward to the current month, and you stop at the page where the entries for the past 4 weeks are recorded. The page is nearly full, and the ink is black and fresh compared to the faded brown of the older pages. You run your finger down the column of outgoing payments, and you read each entry to yourself in a soft murmur that is barely audible even to your own ears. The beechwood from the Bertelli family, and the soda ash from the Levant, and the river pebbles from the Ticino, and the fire clay from Vicenza. The manganese from the apothecary, and the iron rod for the Pontello, and the leather belt for the bellows. Each entry is a small story of something that arrived on the island, and was transformed by the fire into glass. You turn your attention to the column of incoming payments, the order of beads for the German trading house, and the flat glass panes for the nobleman's villa, and the small sales of drinking glasses to the merchants who come by boat from the main city. The income is slightly less than the outgoing payments because this is the nature of the glass business in the autumn, when the orders are fewer and the costs of materials remain steady. The furnace operates at a small loss during some months and a small profit during others, and over the course of the year the two balance each other so that the enterprise continues. You take up the quill and you dip it in the ink, and you begin to add the column of outgoing payments. You write the numbers on a separate scrap of paper because you will need to check the additions several times before you are satisfied. The numbers are small, and they represent the small transactions of a small business on a small island. 12 soldi for the charcoal, and 8 ducats for the clay, and 47 ducats and 16 soldi for the soda ash. You add them slowly and you write the subtotals at the bottom of the scrap. The final total for the month's outgoing payments is 112 ducats and 8 soldi. You set this scrap aside and you add the column of incoming payments. The beads for Nuremberg brought in 32 ducats, and the flat glass panes brought in 2 ducats and 12 soldi, and the various small sales brought in another 15 ducats. The total for the month's income is 49 ducats and 12 soldi. The difference between the income and the outgoing payments is a deficit of 62 ducats and 16 soldi. This is not a surprising number, because the autumn is always a slow season, and the furnace has built up a reserve during the busier summer months. The reserve is recorded in a separate section of the ledger, and you will draw from it to pay the workers and the suppliers until the winter orders begin to arrive. You dip the quill again, and you begin to transfer the totals to the main page of the ledger. You write the date, which is the final day of the month, and you write the description, which is simply bilancio del mese, meaning the balance of the month. Then you write the total outgoing payments in the outgoing column and the total income in the income column. The ink is wet, and it shines in the grey light from the window, and you wait for it to dry before you continue. While the ink dries, you look out of the window at the lagoon. The water is still grey, and the distant shape of Venice is still a smudge on the horizon. A single boat is moving across the water, and it is too far away to see any details. It might be a fishing boat returning with the morning's catch, or it might be a barge carrying supplies to one of the other islands. The boat moves slowly, and it leaves a small wake that spreads out behind it in a V shape and then fades into the general texture of the water. The boat reaches the edge of your view, and then it passes behind a cluster of buildings, and it is gone. The ink is dry now, and you turn your attention to the final task of the monthly reconciliation, which is to carry the balance forward to the fresh page that will begin the new month. You turn the page, and you look at the blank columns that await the entries of the coming weeks. The paper is clean and smooth, and the red-ruled lines are sharp and clear. You write the date of the first day of the new month at the top of the page, and you write the balance that you are carrying forward from the previous month. The number is written carefully, and you check it twice against the number on the previous page to be certain that you have not made a mistake. It is at this moment that you notice a small discrepancy. The balance that you have carried forward should match the total of the reserve fund that is recorded in the separate section of the ledger. You turn to that section and you compare the two numbers. The reserve fund shows a total that is 3 soldi less than the balance you have just written. The difference is tiny, and it represents less than the cost of a single loaf of bread. But a discrepancy of any size must be found and corrected, because the books must balance to the last soldo. You do not feel frustration or impatience, because these emotions have no place in the quiet work of accounting. You simply begin the methodical process of tracing the error back to its source. You start with the most recent entries and you work backward through the month. You check the addition of the outgoing payments and you find that it is correct. You check the addition of the incoming payments and you find that it is also correct. You check the subtraction that you perform to find the monthly deficit and you find that it is correct as well. The error must be somewhere in the reserve fund entries. You turn to that section and you review each transaction that affected the reserve during the past month. There were only a few such transactions because the reserve is meant to be touched only when necessary. You paid the master Lorenzo his monthly wage from the reserve, and you paid the boy who works the bellows and the boy who tends the lair. You also paid the woman who supplies the bread and the man who brings the fresh water from the well on the main island. These payments are recorded in a small neat hand, and you check each one against the running total. You find the error in the entry for the charcoal used for the small lamp-working torches that the beadmakers use in their homes. The charcoal is a minor expense, and it is recorded in the reserve section because it is paid for separately from the main furnace supplies. You wrote the cost as 8 soldi, but the actual cost was 11 soldi. The difference of 3 soldi is the exact amount of the discrepancy. You remember now that the charcoal seller raised his price slightly at the beginning of the month, and you made a mental note of the change, but you forgot to update the entry in the ledger. The mental note remained in your mind while the written record remained incorrect. You take up the quill, and you dip it in the ink, and you make a small correction. You cross out the number 8 with a single neat line, and you write the number 11 beside it. The correction is visible, and it will be visible to anyone who examines the books in the future. There is no shame in a correction because the purpose of the ledger is to record the truth, and the truth sometimes requires that a mistake be acknowledged and fixed. The crossed-out number is a small honest mark that shows the book has been kept by a human hand rather than by a machine. You update the running total in the reserve section, and you carry the corrected balance forward to the main page. The numbers now align, and the books are balanced. The discrepancy of 3 soldi has been found and corrected, and the ledger once again reflects the true state of the furnace's finances. You set down the quill, and you take up the small piece of blotting paper, and you press it gently over the fresh ink. The blotting paper absorbs the excess, and when you lift it away, the writing beneath is crisp and dry. You close the ledger slowly, and you hear the soft, heavy sound of the cover settling against the pages. You place both hands on the cover, and you feel the warmth that has transferred from your palms into the leather over the course of the morning. The book sits solid and heavy on the desk, and it contains the complete and accurate record of the furnace's business for the past month and for the past 30 years. The numbers are balanced, and the errors are corrected, and the work is done. You sit for a moment, and you let the stillness of the office settle around you. The furnace next door has reached its full working temperature, and the sound through the wall is now a deep, steady roar. The master Lorenzo will be gathering the first glass of the day, and the boy will be working the bellows, and the other boy will be waiting at the lair. The beadmakers will be sitting by their windows, and the barge pilots will be moving across the lagoon with their loads of wood and sand and clay. The world of the island continues in its slow, patient rhythm, and the ledger sits closed on the desk, and it asks nothing more of you today. The light through the window has shifted slightly, and it now falls across the corner of the desk where the inkstand sits. The dust that settled on the brass scale yesterday is still there, and it will still be there tomorrow, because you have not yet wiped it away. The quill rests in its pot of sand, and the ink dish is covered with its slate lid. The scrap of paper with the addition sums is crumpled in your hand, and you smooth it flat and place it in the drawer where it will be forgotten until the next reconciliation. You rise from the stool, and you walk to the door that leads to the furnace room. You open the door, and you stand in the threshold, and you feel the warmth of the fire on your face. The room is filled with the orange glow of the furnace and the sounds of the glassmaking. Lorenzo is at the bench, and he is shaping a simple goblet with his steady, patient hands. He does not look up because he knows you are there, and he does not need to acknowledge your presence. You watch him for a moment, and then you close the door, and you return to the office. The day is still young, and there are other small tasks that you could perform. You could walk to the storehouse and check the seal again. You could count the bundles of beads in the wooden box. You could write a list of the supplies that will need to be ordered in the coming weeks. But you do none of these things. You sit down on the stool and you place your hands on the closed ledger, and you let the morning pass in quiet stillness. The work of the month is complete, and the books are balanced, and there is nothing that requires your immediate attention. The afternoon will come, and the evening will follow, and the night will settle over the island. The tide will rise and fall, and the furnace will roar, and then bank its fires for the night. The glass will cool in the lair, and the beads will be counted, and the wood will be stacked in the shed. Tomorrow you will open the ledger again, and you will begin the entries for the new month. The soda ash will arrive, and the clay will be delivered, and the orders will come from the merchants in the distant cities. The work will continue as it has always continued, and the numbers will be recorded, and the books will be balanced. You sit and you listen to the sounds of the furnace and the water and the distant voices of the island. The wool shawl is warm around your shoulders, and the wood of the desk is smooth beneath your hands. The closed ledger contains the history of the furnace, and it will contain the history of the future as well, when the future becomes the present and the present becomes the past. For now, the book is closed, and the ink is dry, and the numbers are balanced. The day is calm, and the lagoon is grey, and the glass is being made in the next room. You remain on the stool as the morning advances toward midday. The light through the window brightens slightly and then holds steady. The furnace hums its endless note, and the water laps at the stones. You do nothing, and you think nothing, and you simply exist in the quiet space of the office, with the closed book and the still air and the patient wait of the day. The balance of the month is complete, and the balance of the day is simply to be present and to breathe, and to let the slow rhythms of the island carry you forward into the afternoon, and the evening, and the night that will follow. The candle on the desk is unlit because the day is still bright enough to see by, and it will remain unlit until the evening comes, and you will light it then, and you will sit with its small flame, and you will listen to the water and the fire, and you will listen to the water and the fire, and you will let the day come to its gentle close.